White Gold by Brian John Grieveson. Dedicated to Sam. Chapter 1, Colombia. The Caribbean seemed a light emerald green, and small islands disappeared under the wing of our plane as we flew over the Gulf of Mexico. Seagull was dressed in jeans, but with a spotless white blouse. Her dark black hair cascaded over her shoulders and gave off a teasing whiff of perfume. For most of the night she sat looking out the window while I sat watching her. The airport at Barranquilla seemed like a dream. As the plane lost altitude, you could see acres upon acres of low-lying palm groves. Suddenly the canopy of fronds was replaced by the dazzling white concrete of the runway. There was an inevitable tingling in my stomach as the plane touched down, bounced briefly in the air, and slowly taxied to a halt. As we stepped off the gangway, the heat hit us in the face like a brick oven. It was impossible to stare at the sheet metal Quonset huts, which served as hangars, and reflected the intense sunlight. Visible heat waves shimmered in distorted images as we walked across the tarmac to the terminal. Inside the terminal, pandemonium reigned. Noise, color, and sound assaulted the senses. She looked at me in confusion, and I touched her arm for assurance. Neither of us spoke any Spanish, but I had a poquito vocabulary and could translate most signs. We collected our luggage and pushed our way through the crowd to the camp stands outside. The airport was several miles from town. I negotiated a price, and we climbed into the back of a '54 Chev. The cab rattled along as if it was held together by baling wire. All the other cars were at least 15 to 20 years old. It was as if we had traveled in time instead of space. Small industrial sites mingled with adobe shacks and galvanized steel shanties along the sides of the highway. Seagull was aghast at the spectacle of poverty, which surpassed even the meanest Indian reservation in Canada. Her lips were pursed tight, and we rode in silence. "American?" the cab driver queried. He had on a greasy-colored shirt stained with sweat. "Canadian," I answered. "Hippie?" he pressed. I nodded. My beard and longish hair needed no other explanation. "You come to Colombia for the marijuana?" he grinned. I grinned back at him. "Of course." He pulled the cover off his automobile horn and pulled out a bag of marijuana. "Santa Marta Gold," he said with pride. "The best in all Colombia." I bought the ounce for $10 and tipped him another couple of bucks when he left us at a modern but modest hotel. We deposited the luggage in our room and changed into our bathing suits. Seagull was dismayed to find herself sweating after only a few hours in this tropical paradise. A swim was the only thing on her mind. There was an indoor pool in the courtyard of high whitewashed walls. Some unfamiliar trees hung over the walls, and occasionally a fragrant blossom would fall softly on the mosaic tiles. After swimming a few laps, I left her in the pool and ordered a waiter to bring some cold beers to an umbrella-shaded table. That evening I spread the pot out on a newspaper, crushed the buds, and shook loose the seeds. Its fragrance was sweet and sticky. Indeed, it was the finest quality. "Where did he say it came from?" Seagull asked. "Santa Marta, a resort town on the Atlantic coast. They grow it in the mountains." "Is that where we're going?" "Yes, we'll take a train in the morning." We turned out the lights and climbed into bed. Automatically I reached for her. "No," she said firmly, "it's too hot." I sighed and folded my hands underneath my head. The tropical ceiling fan hummed softly in the darkness. It took a long time to go to sleep. Santa Marta was a resort town. It had none of the industry or obvious slums of Barranquilla. Poverty must have existed, but it was hidden in back alleys, or most likely in the green-colored hills, which rose majestically in the distance. Santa Marta itself was colorful but clean. It had modern shops and recently whitewashed small bungalows with newer gardens. There were quite a few tourists, but the vast majority of residents were Colombian nationalists. The lawyers, stockbrokers, bankers, and industrials lived in Bogata, but Bogata was high in the Andes, and from all accounts it was a cold, dismal place. It was a good place to make money, but a lousy one to retire or take a vacation. An apt comparison would be Bogata to Chicago and Santa Marta to Miami Beach. We booked a room at the Bolivar, a hotel popular with expatriates and situated directly on the beach. The sheets were clean, the food good, and the tropical fans adequate. Seagull showered and changed her clothes, which she now did 2 or 3 times a day. That evening we went to dinner at a restaurant in town. The menu was in Spanish, and she looked at me helplessly. We had already learned the pearls of ordering at random. Something that looks to be a salad on the menu could easily turn out to be squid. The safest bet seemed to be beefsteak de caballo. I thought caballo meant cowboy, and I knew beefsteak meant steak, so I figured we couldn't go far wrong. It was delicious and quickly formed part of our staple diet. It was about a week later that I was thumbing through a pocket Spanish-English dictionary and discovered that caballo meant horse. I broke the bad news to Seagull, whose face turned an ashen gray as she absorbed the full implications. Since I had already been eating it for a week, I continued to do so, but Seagull never ate beefsteak de caballo again. Seagull rarely smoked pot, but loved her whiskey and beer. I seemed to be equally addicted to both. As far as my smoking habits were concerned, I tried to be discreet. Usually I smoked in the privacy of my hotel room, but occasionally I pre-rolled a joint and took it down to the ocean. One night, soon after we got there, we were walking along the beach. I was halfway through the joint and happily contemplating cosmic love when I was blinded by a flashlight and somebody hollered. My fingers flicked automatically and the roach went spinning into the ocean. When the light switched from me to her, I made out 2 soldiers in combat uniform. One was holding a flashlight, the other was holding an M1 rifle pointed directly at my chest. I didn't speak fluent Spanish, but there was no mistaking their meaning. I froze. The soldier with the flashlight searched me and found me clean. They asked questions that I couldn't understand. I kept saying, "Que pase, no hablo español. What's wrong, I don't speak Spanish." The soldier shone his flashlight on a sign which had been hidden in the darkness. A rough translation would be "Entry Forbidden Military Zone." I apologized profusely, and as soon as we were given permission, returned to the safety of our hotel. The next day I learned that the Army operated a tourist resort on that section of beach for the benefit of enlisted officers. The influence of the Army was everywhere. Almost every block had 2 or 3 soldiers in green fatigues, with at least one of them carrying a machine gun. Maybe it was the upcoming presidential elections. We saw posters everywhere. Or maybe it was the guerrilla movement called M19. Or it could have been the drug trade, although I think it was hard to say who was involved the most, the guerrillas or the Army. At first we found the soldiers and their guns intimidating, but we soon got used to them. I took several photographs of Seagull hanging onto their arms as they grinned boyishly. The guns, however, were real. The second night in Santa Marta I was awakened by gunfire. Seagull was still asleep. I slipped quietly from the bed without disturbing her and approached the window from an angle. The night was ominously still. Another shot rang out, then several others. She rose sleepily from the bed and approached the window. I grabbed her arm and pulled her down beside me. "Don't show yourself," I warned. "You don't want to be hit by a stray bullet, and you don't necessarily want to be a witness." Seagull hung on to me, a slight tremor running through her body. The shots were less frequent now, but still seemed to be coming directly from the beach. Suddenly there were shouts and the sickening sound of somebody being interrogated and beaten. It was so close that it was almost directly outside our window. The whole affair lasted approximately half an hour, and then it was over with. Seagull and I went back to bed, but we were too excited to sleep. We looked into each other's eyes questioningly. "Might as well," she said with a smile. The next morning we ate breakfast on the patio. The hotel was buzzing with talk of the previous night's events. Somebody said it was smugglers, but exactly what they were smuggling was unclear. As we sat drinking our café con leche, we could see the police launch and dinghy, and anchored about 100 yards offshore. 2 native boys jumped over the side, then disappeared under the waves. They surfaced after a few minutes, and then dove under again. "You have to admire them," I observed. "No masks, no tanks." "They look like they were born in the water," she agreed. After 10 or 20 minutes, one of the boys broke the surface and gave a cry of exultation. He held aloft a paint can and passed it into the dinghy. "I wonder what's inside. Drugs?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "Marijuana's too bulky to smuggle that way. Coke is too refined." I pointed to 4 ships at anchor in the harbor. "Drugs probably account for half of Colombia's foreign exports. To put it another way, 2 of those 4 ships should be loaded to the gunwales with pot. Why worry about some sealed, waterproof paint cans?" The native boys had brought up about a dozen cans and were still diving. Eventually we found out what was going on. The paint cans were filled with black market merchandise. One of the ships had launched a lifeboat in the middle of the night, and they were smuggling goods into the country without paying import tax. That's what the government was so uptight about. When the smugglers were intercepted, they dumped the paint cans overboard and made a run for it. That's what the shooting was about. Eventually they were caught and arrested. I would have thought that after such serious gunplay the smugglers would be in deep trouble. As it turned out, they were fined $100 each, which was paid by the captain of the ship, and they sailed a couple of days later. Santa Marta was a seaport, but pretty mild supposedly to its major rival, Cartagena. Both ports had been havens for pirates and buccaneers for most of their history, burned, plundered, and built again. As an experienced traveler, I kept my passport and traveler's checks in a flat wallet which hung around my neck. That way it was difficult to lose it to a pickpocket or leave it behind in some bar. Other travelers we met at the hotel warned us to carry at least $10 in a separate pocket if we visited Cartagena. Armed muggings were routine occurrences. If somebody flashed a knife or pistol and said your money or your life, it was less hassle to give them $10 than to fight. Several tourists had been murdered recently because they didn't realize how cheap life was in Colombia. There was a tension in the air which I had noticed in Mexico 12 years previously. The Indian hated the half-breed, both of them hated the pure Spanish aristocracy, and everybody hated the gringo. As everywhere, friends are what you make them. But it was impossible to ignore the heavy racial overtones which lurked just under the surface. I looked at Seagull and wondered what she made of all this. Several times when she had been mad she had said, "That's mighty white of you." That kind of remark hurt, even though it was made in a half-joking manner. My God, I loved her more than any woman in the world. What more could she ask of me? My investigation showed that coke was cheaper in Bogata than Santa Marta. Coca leaves thrived in high altitudes and Bogata was in the mountains. There is some cultivation of coca leaves in Colombia, and these leaves were refined into a gummy powder called pasto in remote mountain villages. This paste was then transported to Bogata where it was refined into cocaine. Altogether, though, Colombian cocaine got poor marks from connoisseurs compared to Peruvian flake or Bolivian pink rock. Still, I had to follow the trail, and Bogata was the next stop. Seagull and I had a serious discussion. She had a return air ticket. She was free to use it any time she wished. There were no commitments except our love and respect for each other. On the other hand, I made it clear to her that if she left for Canada, I would stay behind and see as much as I could. This was a unique opportunity. I'd probably never see South America again for the rest of my life. In many ways, my quest for knowledge was greater than my quest for gold. In all honesty, I wondered that the middle-class honeymoon was over. Whatever happened, from now on I was going to be living cheaply, as close to the peasants as possible. If Seagull was willing to share this lifestyle, then we would travel and return to Canada together. Just to prove a point, I suppose, the train tickets I bought for Bogota were third class. The Tourist Express took 8 hours. Third class was a milk run, stopping at every small village along the way and taking 48 hours. Even though Santa Marta was only several hundred miles from the equator, Bogota was situated in the Cordillera Central at 8,600 feet. It was bound to be cold at night in the mountains. I bought each of us a serape, a woolen poncho which fitted over the head and was sleeveless like a blanket. Also, I bought each of us a wide-brimmed straw sombrero, a trademark of Colombia through all of South America. Grabbing our luggage and 2 bottles of Johnny Walker Special, we boarded the train for the interior. Seagull looked askance at the hard wooden seats, the old clothes of the peasant women, the grimy clothes of the men with their weather-beaten faces and gray mustaches. There was a distinct smell of sweat and chickens. The train lurched forward and another journey began. "For Christ's sake, open the window," she urged. It seemed to be jammed and took several minutes to force it open. Immediately a whiff of coal dust from the steam engine assaulted us. This was combined with a gritty sand as we left the lush coastal region and labored our way into the drier interior. "Oh, never mind," she said with exasperation. "You might as well close it again." I grinned at her and opened a bottle of scotch. I love you, I said, wetting my finger and rubbing a smudge of coal dust off her nose. Bogata was built on an altiplane, that is a large vast area surrounded by mountains. On sunny days it had a pleasant climate. On rainy days it was raw, damp, and cold. There were no traces of the carefree Caribbean here. The psychic energy was Indian, aloof and hard. It had many examples of Spanish colonial architecture, but it was also a modern industrial city of over 2 million people, and the inevitable traffic, smog, and noise. Both of us were glad to get off that bloody train. We found a small pension, the kind of place that rented rooms to students and commercial salesmen. No indoor swimming pools here. In fact, the washroom was in the hallway. The first thing on Seagull's mind was a shower. She left to take one and then came back to ask me how the hot water worked. It was the strangest hot water heater I ever saw. There wasn't any tank, just a box. Apparently the water was heated as it passed through the box. There were instructions, but they had mostly peeled off, and what was visible was in Spanish. One instruction was pretty obvious. For hot water, turn here. I threw the switch and there was an arcing blue flash. I switched it off again. Properly installed and maintained, it probably worked. This one didn't. We wound up taking cold showers. The next day we went looking for a laundromat. We spent hours looking for one to no avail. When we asked people, they either stared at us blankly or gave us directions to the next street. Almost every block had some sort of dry cleaners, but no laundromat. Finally the truth began to dawn on me. There weren't any. Automatic washing machines were a labor-saving device and all but useless in a society that is chronically unemployed. Also, given the bitter economic conditions, theft was more a trade vocation than a moral crime, and it would have been sheer folly to leave cash in an unguarded coin box. We had only been in Colombia about 3 weeks, and there had been no opportunity to study their political or social welfare system. I suspect that their social safety net was tenuous at best. Traditionally, the Roman Catholic Church has been in charge of feeding the poor, or oppressing them, depending upon your point of view. What immediately struck the eye was the Colombian mania for lotteries. I suppose that in an extremely poor country, winning a lottery represents the only hope that destitute have for success. Even if every working Colombian spent half his income on lottery tickets, it would be hard to explain the incredible number of lottery ticket sellers. One can only presume that most of the unemployed and homeless children sold tickets in the street. It couldn't be a very good living, but at least it was something, and represented a plausible excuse to the police to avoid harassment on vagrancy charges. The other basic industry for the unemployed was hustling. Basically, this fell into 2 categories: emeralds and cocaine. Emeralds are a brilliant, transparent green gemstone. Seagull's eyes lit up with wonder as the teenage youth who sat with us in a restaurant booth unfolded a handkerchief and showed her a half-dozen semi-precious stones. "They're beautiful," she whispered in awe. "Where do they come from?" I asked the youth. "Esmeralda, a province in northwest Colombia." "How do you get there?" I asked. "Oh, you can't go there. It's too dangerous. It's bandit country. Not even the police go there." I took that with a grain of salt. Traveling in Asia, I ran across the same story. "Oh, the people in this village are good, but in the next village they are very bad people. They will cut your throat." Somehow you wind up traveling to the next village, and lo and behold, they tell you the same story. All in all, it's hard to tell who I feared the most, the police or the bandits. "A very good investment," the youth insisted. "In your country you will double your money easily." I thought about that for a moment. It was tempting, but I had 2 objections. One, I wasn't a gemologist. When I agreed to double my money, I could easily wind up with worthless pieces of glass. Besides, I wouldn't have the faintest idea of where to sell smuggled emeralds. "What about cocaine?" I asked. "Oh yes," he assured me. "Very good quality. $20 American a gram." He didn't have any on him, but when I expressed interest, he talked to a friend who quickly disappeared. We ordered another round of Coca-Cola while waiting for his friend to come back. "You don't inject cocaine, do you?" he asked with a worried expression. "No," I said, smiling. 10 years ago I used to inject cocaine and heroin 6 times a day, but not any longer. I only snort it now." "Very good," he agreed. "It's very bad to inject cocaine." His friend took about 10 minutes to return. During that time he mentioned twice more how dangerous it was to inject cocaine. This should have tipped me off, but By nature I'm a rather gullible, trusting person. When his friend came back with a gram wrapped in waxed paper, I opened it, smelt it, and tasted it. It seemed vaguely familiar, so I bought it for $20, and Seagull and I returned to the hotel. I dumped the powder out on the flat surface of a mirror and cut it finely with a razor blade. It was a brownish white and more gummy than I expected. Seagull was anxious to try it, but I insisted that I should do it first, and she should wait for at least 15 minutes until I was sure of its quality. I rolled up a $20 bill, and using it as a straw, I snorted a fair-sized line. "What's wrong?" she asked in alarm. The disgust must have shown on my face. I waited a moment before answering. There's something there, all right, but it's been cut with something. I've had better quality coke in Toronto." As it turned out, it hadn't been cut with anything. I had unknowingly bought a gram of pasta, the unrefined base, which had only 10% potency. It was meant for smoking, not snorting, and it was only worth $5 per gram. Jesus, I was mad. No wonder he had warned me against injecting it. If I had, it could have killed me. What kind of scum would risk someone dying in order to rip off $20 lousy dollars? Of course, it was my own fault. In my extensive experience with drugs, only cannabis and certain psychedelics have any redeeming qualities whatsoever. In the first place, they are physically harmless in the sense that it's impossible to take a fatal overdose. In the second place, they are a potentially mind-expanding drug. Put them in the hands of an Aldous Huxley or an Alan Watts, and you have a deep insight into philosophy and human nature. But it's not the drug, it's the person who uses it. Cocaine, like speed or amphetamines, has a definite harmful effect on the human psyche. Prolonged use will result in a sort of drug-induced schizophrenia marked by paranoia, aggressiveness, and a distorted sense of reality. We had sampled the finest Colombian gold in Santa Marta and some not-so-fine cocaine paste in Bogata. The only thing left was the magic mushroom known by its scientific name as Psilocybin cubensis. According to our fellow travelers, there were two major villages in Colombia that were known for their mushroom folklore, San Agustin and Silva. San Agustin was also a tourist center with hotels and horseback riding and nature trails. I left the choice up to Seagull. We spent another week in Bogata visiting museums, churches, and historical monuments, but at the end of the week we boarded a bus for Popayan, a small town on the way to San Agustin. It was a third-class bus, filled with laborers, farmers, and squawking chickens. It was hot, dusty, and smelly, yet somehow still exciting because it was a new experience. We had our luggage with us to make sure it wasn't stolen. Some people claimed that the thieves were so good that they could walk behind you, slice open the nylon with a knife, and remove your camera, and you would keep on walking unawares that anything had taken place. Anyhow, Seagull had a knapsack, and I had a knapsack and a briefcase. The only thing in the briefcase was a manuscript of a novel and a few poems. After a few hours, the steady jogging of the bus lulled me to sleep. She woke me up when we stopped at Popayan. The passengers who were getting off there were already disembarking. I grabbed the knapsack and looked for the briefcase. It was gone. I hurried after Seagull. "The briefcase," I exclaimed in panic. "Do you have it?" "No," she said, shaking her head. I hurried back on the bus and went to the very back. Seat by seat, I asked people to move their legs and search for the damn thing. People were naturally upset at this arrogant gringo, but were intimidated by my exploding rage. I searched the whole bus, but couldn't find it. The driver protested. He had a schedule to keep. He had to move on. "Like hell you will," I shouted at him. I looked at Seagull for help. "Think," I pleaded with her. She screwed her eyes tight with concentration. "The man and woman sitting in front of us. The woman's wearing a cloak. Look under it." I hurried back on board the bus, went directly to the couple who had been sitting in front of us. He was a young man in his late 20s. His wife was pretty and looked like she was pregnant. Impossible, I thought. They looked so young and innocent. "The briefcase," I demanded. He shrugged his shoulders nervously. "No hablo inglés." Fuck him, I thought. I clenched my fist and drew back my arm. One more second, I was going to smash his teeth down his throat. Suddenly, his wife lifted her cloak and held out the briefcase. I grabbed it and backed down the aisle and off the bus. "Call the cops," I told Seagull. "Listen," she pleaded. "He didn't know what was in it. You've got it back. Let him go." I looked into her eyes. My anger dissipated. "Okay." I nodded towards the driver, who was still paralyzed with shock. "Vamos." I was still trembling with anger. I took Seagull's arm. We went to the nearest bar and ordered several quart-sized bottles of beer. Thanks, I said, toasting her glass. I meant it. My highest respect goes to a woman who loves her man enough to keep him out of trouble, not the kind of woman who tries to get him into it. St. Augustine was a pleasant place. It was high enough in altitude that it wasn't too bad, and yet low enough in altitude that it wasn't too cold. We asked the locals about the mushrooms. They smiled knowingly and said they only appeared after a rain. Unfortunately, the sky was blue without a cloud in sight. We had a large, clean room with a second-story veranda. Every day we went horseback riding. We should have been happy, but we weren't. Seagull was moody and irritable. For several days we had slept together without making love. One night I persisted, and she relented. It wasn't much good. In spite of my passion, she lay there like a block of ice. The more arduous I became, the less responsive she was. We lay next to each other. The silence was uncomfortable and oppressive. She said finally, "I want to go home." I stared at the ceiling moodily. "We haven't found the mushrooms yet." "I don't care," she said quietly. "I want to go back to Canada." Damn her, I thought. I didn't want her to leave, but I couldn't go home yet. Besides, she had never told me she loved me. Her frigidity only proved that she didn't. She had her good time. As long as the money lasted, she was friends. As soon as it ran out, she would leave. "Okay," I said wearily. "We'll leave for Popayan in the morning. You can go back to Canada. I'm going to Silva." Tears came into my eyes, but I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of hearing me cry. The bus trip back to Popayan was a strained and nervous one. I kept hoping all the time that Seagull would change her mind and come to Silva with me. If she had, I think I would have returned to Canada with her. Alas, it wasn't meant to be. We checked in a hotel for one night, and I bought her a bus ticket back to Bogata. "Don't lose your return ticket from Barranquilla," I warned her. "I won't," she promised. "You've got your ticket from Miami to Toronto?" "Yes," she answered dully. "Well, here's another $40, I said sadly. "That'll pay your train fare from Bogata to Barranquilla, give you enough to eat for a few days, and let you get a cheap hotel overnight." Seagull took the money hesitantly. I expected her to ask for more. If she did, I would have given it to her. It was barely enough for her to survive on, but my own jealousy prevented me from offering her more. I still hoped she would change her mind at the last minute and stay with me. "Don't forget," I repeated as I had many times before, "if you run into any difficulty at all, financial or otherwise, get in touch with the Canadian Embassy in Bogota. You're a Canadian citizen. They have to help you. Don't be shy about it. It's their responsibility, and that's what they're there for." "I know," she said sharply, with anger flashing in her eyes. "You've told me that many times." She was silent. She had nothing to say. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Her bus left in 10 minutes. I fought hard to keep down the panic that was rising in my chest. I thought I was going to be sick. "Listen," I said, putting both hands on her shoulder. "You know where we're staying at. I'm going to Silva for a week. Then I'll be coming back to this hotel. You can leave a message here if you want to get in touch. Just in case you change your mind and come back here, I'll leave word with the hotel manager that I'll be responsible for your bill." She looked at me with a smile on her lips, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was a tragic one. "Seagull," I said, embracing her, "I love you." She hugged me back, but turned her head. She wouldn't kiss me, not even now. The bus tooted its horn. It was time to leave. She grabbed her knapsack and got on board. A gentleman gave up his seat for her so she could sit next to the window. I felt awful pangs of jealousy. Her face was pressed against the glass. There was a smile on her lips, but tears in her eyes. The bus started its engine. I almost choked on the diesel fumes. Suddenly it lurched into gear, and I disappeared down the highway in a cloud of red dust. Suddenly it lurched into gear and disappeared down the highway in a cloud of red dust. I went back to my hotel room and cried myself to sleep. The next morning I caught the bus to a village some 15 miles from Silva. To my surprise, there was no connecting bus. There were 3 other passengers bound for the same destination, and we shared a taxicab. For the last few miles the road climbed steadily with hairpin curves. The trees had virtually disappeared, and the round-shaped hills were covered with green grass. When the taxicab stopped in Silva, I was surprised by the simplicity of the village square. There was a simple wooden white-painted church. There were several modest stores, and one-story buildings surrounding the square. A small patch of lawn, the inevitable statue of Bolivar, and a few wrought iron park benches completed the scenario. There were a score or more people around, yet compared to the average Colombian village it was almost deserted. Even the noise in the square seemed shallow, almost drowned out by the silence of the hills and streets which surrounded it. There were 3 hotels, but apparently the foreigners congregated at the same one. I was given directions and set off with the knapsack over my back. The 2 main streets consisted of hard-packed earth. The buildings were made of earth and wood, one house running into the next, and only distinguishable by the heavy wooden doors set into the 10-foot walls and opening directly in onto the street. It was unlike anything I had seen before. There were no cars, only mules, and the architecture reminded me of the Wild West. Suddenly it struck me that this whole village was designed for defense. The stout doors and high walls were meant to repel strangers and protect the families inside. This frontier atmosphere was strengthened by the realization that all the faces I saw were somber and had Indian features. Even the children playing in the street were unnaturally stoic and quiet. I found the address of the hotel and rang the bell by the entrance. The door opened and I was led into an inner courtyard. The rooms were arranged in a square around the courtyard. It was sparse but clean. I slung my knapsack in the corner and washed my hands and face in a basin with a pitcher of cold water. I smoked a joint in the privacy of my room before preparing myself to meet my fellow guests. There were 5 of us altogether, foreigners that is. Besides myself, there was an Austrian, an Englishman, and 2 Japanese. The Austrian and Englishman were playing cards. Care to join us, they asked. No thanks, I declined. Been here long? A couple of weeks, the Austrian replied. He looked up and grinned. Couldn't help smelling the pot. You indulge, I asked. Of course, but I haven't smoked since I've been here. None of the Indians smoke grass. I reached down in my cowboy boots and took out a bag. Be my guest. The Englishman laughed. Love to, mate, but not here. Come to our room. They were sharing a room with 2 cots. Come for the mushrooms, have you? Is it that obvious? That's the only reason any foreigner comes to Silva, the Austrian replied. Where do you find them? In cow paddies. Almost anywhere, actually. They've been grazing cows in these hills for 100 years. What do they look like? White mostly, thick stem. Pinch them and they turn blue. That's the best way to tell. Got any I can see? Not right now, but we have some tea, he said, pointing to a Coleman stove and an aluminum pot. Witch's brew. Care to try some? Maybe later, I laughed. I'd rather orientate myself first. Roosters crowing woke me from a good night's sleep. I stared at the whitewashed walls, and it took me a moment to realize where I was. The air was brisk, even downright chilly. I washed my face and hands in a basin of cold water and threw on a sweater. No one was up in the hotel. So I slipped into the street. Cocks were still crowing in the distance, and life was audibly stirring behind wooden doors. There was already another customer at the small cafe in the square. I drank 3 or 4 cups of strong black coffee and waited for some of the shops to open. By mid-afternoon the sun would be uncomfortably hot, and I decided to get an early start if I was going to walk up in the hills to find some shrooms. I took along some bread, oranges, and a string bag. A plastic bag is practically useless for collecting, since mushrooms deteriorate quickly unless they are well ventilated. The best clue the Austrian had been able to give me was to check the cow patties. He had warned me that it may take a long time to find one, but when you do, there are often others nearby. For the first hour I inspected each paddy I came across with minute care. I had done so much jumping up and down that my legs were getting tired. By the end of the day, I felt I would become an expert on cow shit. It was exciting to find my first mushrooms, but they were so small that I had difficulty establishing what kind they were. Often the Indians ate them as they came across them, but since some varieties were poisonous, I thought discretion was the better part of valor. By 9 o'clock I had discarded my sweater. By 11 I was sweating profusely under the straw sombrero. By this time I collected about a dozen, but there were several types. I decided to return to the hotel to find out which were which. To my dismay, only 3 of them could be positively identified as psilocybin cubensis. There wasn't much to show for 6 hours' work, so I was tired and discouraged. I went back to my room to take a nap. In fact, most of the village closed down in the early afternoon. It was called siesta. I ate the mushrooms around 5 o'clock and washed them down with cold water. There wasn't any point eating supper. According to folklore, they worked faster on an empty stomach. I waited an hour, but nothing seemed to be happening. I went down to a tavern in the square. The tavern was called a disco. Actually, it was the last thing you expected in so remote and simple a village. It wasn't anything like a disco in the city, but the psychedelic influence was unmistakable. I chose a stool at the bar and ordered a beer. My thoughts, of course, were concentrated on Seagull. When I was active during the day, it wasn't so bad, but it was at night that I really missed her. I expected that she was in Bogata, or probably on her way to Barranquilla. I started thinking of how I met her and all the various experiences, both happy and sad, that we had gone through together. I could almost see her eyes laughing in front of me, see the whiteness of her teeth, and smell the exciting, musky odor of her skin. I could hear her voice inside my skull, whole conversations that were repeated word for word, although some of them were a year old. Listening to them again, I realized she had probably meant something quite different from how I had interpreted it at the time. Sometimes it seemed that human beings had very little direct communication. It was more like I had been talking to my image of what she should be, and when she was talking to me, I heard her, but I wasn't really listening, at least not in the sense that she wanted me to. Draining my glass, I ordered another beer. I was a little disappointed in the mushrooms. There were no visual hallucinations. In fact, I didn't feel anything at all. Then I noticed the clock on the wall behind me. My God, 2 hours had passed. A shiver went down my spine as I realized that I must be stoned out of my gourd. If the mushrooms weren't working, then I'd have drank 6 beers at least by now instead of 1. From that point, the sensations I was feeling came quicker and more intensively. I lost all track of time. It simply wasn't relevant to the reality I was experiencing. Suddenly there was a man standing at my shoulder. He was Indian, but with a trace of Spanish blood. He wore a poncho, loose pants, and sandals. His curly black hair grew out wild in uncombed wonder. But the startling feature was his flashing black eyes. The pupils were enlarged, and they seemed wild, stoned, and dangerous. I couldn't help feeling shock, bewilderment, and more than a touch of fear as I looked into his eyes. The first question to flash through my mind was, what does he want from me? His eyes held steady and never wavered. Someone had to speak, so I offered to buy him a beer. Alcohol, no, he said with difficulty. Crystal. I looked at him blankly, not comprehending what he wanted to say. Crystal, he said, tapping me on the chest. Crystal, he repeated, tapping his chest as well. Still I didn't understand. Suddenly he held up his finger, the one next to his thumb. Just below the joint there was a blue stain or ring. Crystal, he repeated, and before I knew what was happening, he took my right hand and held it up to my face. I'll be damned if I didn't have a blue-stained ring on my forefinger as well. Suddenly I comprehended what he was trying to say. The blue stain was where he had squeezed the mushrooms, breaking off the stems. The stain came from psilocybin, the psychoactive ingredient in the mushrooms. When he said Christo, he was telling me he was a Christian, and that the psychedelic experience was part of his faith. When he called me Christo, he was saying that he knew that I was high on mushrooms too, and that made us brothers in Christ. I smiled and nodded, and then he was gone. At this point, some very important realizations took place. LSD had become popular in North America during the mid-60s. A number of philosophers, the best known being Timothy Leary, the high priest of acid, explained the psychedelic experience in religious terms. The theory was that when a person ingested a psychic active substance, it resulted in the temporary death of the ego, that part of our nature which we call our personality. When the ego died, we experienced a oneness with the universe, which most religions of the world called enlightenment. Since the death of the ego was artificially induced, the ego or personality would be reborn as the effects of the psychoactive substances wore off. Originally, the psychedelic experience had been explained in terms of Oriental philosophy, more specifically, Tibetan Buddhism and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. One of the puzzling aspects, however, was that Buddhism had no record of psychoactive substances being used as part of their faith. Instead, enlightenment was attained by meditation, yoga exercises, and the use of koans or logical paradoxes, as exemplified most strongly in the practice of Zen Buddhism. There are many examples of primitive cultures using drug-induced euphoria as part of their ritualistic tribal ceremonies. However, the use of magic mushrooms by Christian Indians in certain parts of South America is rather unique. How is it possible for them to reconcile the use of what we regard as a drug with the Christian articles of faith? There is one important aspect to Christianity which may provide a clue. Whereas Buddhism and Hinduism talk of death and rebirth as a cycle, where people come back in a different body, and Islam talks of paradise after death, Christianity is unique in its claim that a person can die and be reborn again in the spirit of Christ while still inhabiting the same physical body. A very important aspect of Christian mythology is that Christ died, was entombed, and rose again. On Good Friday we mourn the death of Christ. On Easter Sunday we celebrate his rebirth. The act of communion consists of eating wafers of bread, which is supposed to be symbolic of the body of Christ, and drinking grape juice or wine, which is supposed to be symbolic of his blood. Christianity is the most recent of the world's major religions. Is it possible that the concept of dying for one's sins and being born again is related to the psychedelic experience? Is it possible that the ritual of communion is based on the ingestion of psychoactive substances? Apparently some people thought so. A man named John Allegro wrote a book in the mid-70s called The Magic Mushroom and the Cross. He asked the same questions that I have in the preceding paragraphs. He also noted that Christianity is unique in insisting that its prophet was born of virgin birth. He noted that while people at the time of Christ were very familiar with agriculture and the necessity of planting the seed and caring for it to reap what you sow, the mushroom was still an enigma. Spores were so microscopic they could hardly be seen. Furthermore, there was no such thing as a female mushroom or a male mushroom. There are no male or female parts as could be seen in the pistils and stamens of flowers. The mushroom itself seemed to be of virgin birth. It could not be grown the way other plants were, but appeared unpredictably overnight, with no effort by man at all. Part of Christian mythology maintains that man cannot achieve a state of grace by performing good works, but only by accepting Christ into his heart. If there is some relation between the birth of Christianity as a religion and the rediscovery of the psychedelic experience, why doesn't it say so in biblical records? Part of the reason may be that Christianity was taught to people through the use of parables. Part of the reason may be that the books of the New Testament were written by disciples and have probably changed considerably from translation. Is it possible for the origins of a religion to be so obscured that the original meaning is lost in the practice of a ritual or the belief of a dogma? I have been to India several times and developed an interest in Hinduism. Their ancient books are called the Vedas and mention something called soma, which was used by their mythological ancestors for its intoxicating properties. Western translators have never agreed upon what soma may have been. Even Sanskrit scholars and Hindu priests admit they have no idea. The most likely possibilities were thought to be either charas, which means hashish, or shandu, which means opium. The very word soma seems to be related to somniferous, which means causing sleep. This would indicate that the original English translators thought it could have been opium. On the other hand, my experiences in Silva would indicate another possibility. Since the magic mushrooms were found most commonly in cow dung, one would suspect that any ancient mushroom cult would also venerate the cow. Indeed, if one wished to ensure a steady supply of mushrooms and cow dung, what better way to do it than to protect the cow? Even if the secret of producing soma was restricted to priests, and perhaps became a lost art, the ritual of cow veneration would remain long after its purpose had been forgotten. If there is a possibility that the birth of new religions, such as Christianity, was somehow connected with the discovery or rediscovery of psychoactive substances, then it is equally possible that ancient religions such as Hinduism were also connected in some manner to the discovery or rediscovery of psychoactive substances. I did a lot of thinking during the next few days. Several times my friends at the hotel offered me mushroom tea, but I refused. The psychedelic experience loses its strength if trips are taken too close together. The primary thing on my mind, aside from seagull, was how to send the psilocybin spores back to Canada. Most people ate mushrooms in the fields because it was difficult to preserve their potency. Someone suggested they kept very well when submerged in honey, so I bought a jar from the local merchants and took it with me on my walks. Whenever the cap of the mushroom was as small as the filter on a cigarette, I put it in the jar instead of eating it. I collected about a dozen this way. Theoretically speaking, it's easier to grow mushrooms from part of the flesh than it is from spores. I would send the honey back to Canada along with other items as souvenirs. If Canadian Customs asked me what it was when I picked it up, I would say honey. If they noticed the tiny mushroom caps, I would feign ignorance and say it was sold in the mountains that way. There was always the possibility that Customs would seize the honey, so I needed an alternative plan. When I found a cow patty that had the magic mushrooms growing on it, I separated about 10 grams of cow dung with the fine white thread, which indicated mycelium, and dried it in the sun. I mailed this back to a friend. Theoretically, all I would need in Canada would be the proper growing conditions and moisture. As soon as water was added, new mushrooms should sprout. On the fourth day I went back into the fields. It was much easier now that I knew what to look for. In 3 or 4 hours I managed to collect half a dozen. I ate 3 of them and walked down to the stream which flowed into the village. All afternoon I meditated on the bank. The running and gurgling water seemed to carry me away, yet its continuity gave a reassuring peace. It was the Austrian who interrupted my reveries. Just walking back to the hotel. Are you going that way? Sure, I said with a grin. I had a joint rolled and we smoked it on the way. I have no idea what we were talking about, but suddenly I had an intense flash of paranoia. Looking up, I saw 2 soldiers on the other bank. They carried rifles over their shoulders. For a moment it seemed like a scene out of a Vietnam movie. Slowly we walked downstream as they walked upstream. About 100 yards away we came to a stone fence. Taking advantage of the shelter, I sat down, took off a boot, and transferred the pot to the tip of my sock. I put the boot back on and rested for a few minutes before continuing on our way. We came to a bridge and had just started across when 2 soldiers and the police chief appeared out of nowhere. The soldiers had their rifles pointed directly at our chests. The police chief smiled and pointed to the string bag of mushrooms I had over my shoulder. I handed it over to him. Passport, he demanded of us both. I readily complied. I could see the Austrian was even more shook up than me. Grass, the police chief asked. No, I said, shaking my head. Cocaine, he demanded. No. I stood there calmly while one of the soldiers lowered his rifle and gave me a quick frisk. He even felt my boots, and I could feel the adrenaline rushing to my head. The soldier stepped back and shook his head. The police chief seemed positively annoyed. He handed us back our passports, and to my surprise, he gave me back the bag of mushrooms as well. Obviously, they didn't consider that a drug. Good God, the Austrian exclaimed as we continued our walk. That was a close one. I couldn't help grinning now that the tension was over. Any idea what the penalty for possession of pot is here? A $60 bribe, he said ruefully. I haven't heard of anyone refusing to pay. Well, I mused, that's the end of smoking it in the hotel. According to the Englishman, there was a cockfight that evening. The idea both repulsed yet fascinated me. I had once been to a bullfight in Acapulco, Mexico in 1965. It was for the experience, and I never went back again. The same curiosity made a cockfight irresistible. Just before dark, I went down to the bar and drank with some Colombians. We left together and wandered down the back street to a warehouse. There were two men standing on guard in the alley. They looked us over, said something in Spanish, and the door was unbolted from the inside. Wooden chairs and benches were arranged around the walls of the room. They were in ascending order so everyone could have a good view. The center of the room had a shallow cockpit dug out of the ground. It was covered with sawdust and had plank walls. Slowly the room began filling up with 20 or 30 men. Someone called to me, and I looked up to see the police chief sitting on one of the benches. He beckoned to me and motioned me to sit down beside him. It was an invitation that I could hardly refuse. Our conversation was limited because of the language barrier, but we seemed to establish a very wary truce. Down by the pit, half a dozen men were cradling their gamecocks in their arms. The fighting roosters occasionally shrieked aggressively, but the men holding them would calm them down by stroking their feathers. Money was being counted and changed hands. Obviously, they were arranging matches and making bets. When the first two cocks were chosen, they were fitted with metal spurs with wickedly sharp blades. Then the men thrust the roosters within reach of each other, so furious pecking resulted. This was repeated several times to let the cocks build up an active case of hatred for each other. At a given signal, both men threw the cocks into the pit. They attacked each other with a blur of action. Feathers and blood spurted everywhere. It was over in a minute. Money changed hands. The dead cock lost its spurs and was dumped unceremoniously into a bag. The police chief suggested we have a little side bet on the next fight. I didn't think it was such a good idea, but didn't see how I could graciously refuse either. Finally, I chose my bird, put up $10 to match his, and the money was given to a third man. There was only one survivor in these matches, and I was pleasantly surprised to see my cock win. I reached out my hand for the money, but the police chief objected. He insisted he had bet on the gamecock who had survived the fight. Suddenly it began to make sense. $60 if you were caught with pot, $10 if you weren't. The men immediately around us grew silent. I looked them over. There were some 30 South Americans in that room, and I was the only gringo. There was no way I could win a fight with the chief of police. Okay, I said slowly. You win. I started to leave, but he grabbed my arm. One more bet, he insisted. Bullshit is what I thought. I removed his hand with determination and slowly walked across the room. A guard unbolted the door, and I stepped into the fresh air of the alley. When I returned to Papayan, the first thing I did was go back to my hotel and ask if there had been any messages. Part of me hoped that Seagull would be there. At the very least, I expected a letter. Nothing. They gave me the same room we had been sharing when she left. I took off my boots and lay down on the bed. I had saved 4 mushrooms for her, and I decided I might as well do them myself. Right from the start, it was a bad trip. Maybe it was the location. Maybe there was a bad mushroom. Maybe it was the depression I had from having just broken up with Seagull. I missed her horribly. I knew she was in Canada, probably at the booze can, and all my old friends would be coming on to her. It drove me insane with jealousy. On the previous trip, I realized that pain was the price of loving woman. This trip, I felt a fool for letting her go. My emotions made me physically sick, and I vomited into the sink. Paranoia set in that I had picked a deadly mushroom and I felt I was going to die. I clutched the pillow and waited. It was sleep that came. Traveling was the best way to forget her, and I went about it with a vengeance. I set myself a goal, to go as far south as possible, maybe the islands of Tierra del Fuego and the Straits of Magellan on the tip of Argentina. From now on I would live on a bus. The trip to the border of Ecuador took 3 days. The second night we stopped over in a mountain town called Pasto. It was raining and the wet cobblestones of the street reflected the lights. I wandered through a section of back streets and found a working man's bar. Here's to Seagull, I toasted myself, and proceeded to get seriously drunk. Once I relaxed, the other patrons got friendly too. The only tension came when an armed police patrol made a routine inspection. They stared at me for a long time, then spoke to the owner. Naturally, they came over and asked for my passport. After a few questions, they decided to leave me alone. An innate wariness warned me that it was okay to get drunk, but that I better stay sober enough to stand on my feet. After downing about 4 quarts of beer, I had a nice cheerful buzz on. I bid my pleasant company good evening and headed back to my hotel. A couple of young ladies were walking down the street. I smiled at them and they smiled back. Next thing you know, I had an arm around both of them and had offered to buy them a drink. What the hell, I thought. One more can't hurt. Both of them were rather pretty. They took me to a bar and ordered the Colombian equivalent of Singapore slings. I settled for a beer. Just looking at them made me horny as hell. We came to gentlemen's agreement, but it seems both of them wanted to go back to the hotel with me. That was more than I bargained for, even if it only was $10 each. I insisted I only wanted one. The ladies argued back and forth, but I'm glad the youngest and prettiest won. The hardest part was getting her past the hotel clerk at his desk. They got into an argument. I was afraid there would be a row. I guess we won, but she must have been pretty mad at him. When we got to my room, she stripped off her clothes and squatted on the floor to take a piss. Even in my drunkenness, I was shocked beyond belief. How does one handle a situation like that? Well, it would have been ridiculous to back out now, so I stripped off my clothes and motioned her to join me in bed. Afterwards, we sat in bed and smoked a couple of cigarettes. She had been a good lay. It was just what I needed at that moment. Sex without complications. It could never replace Seagull, but the pure physical satisfaction drained the tension from my body. Chapter 2. Ecuador and Peru. The first bus from the border was a Volkswagen van. Traveling was the best way to forget her, and I went about it with a vengeance. I set myself a goal to go as far south as possible, maybe the islands. Oops. Chapter 2. Ecuador and Peru. The first bus from the border was a Volkswagen van. There were 6 passengers and we had a record 3 flat tires, no spares. About 100 kilometers further we ran into a roadside army post. We were filed inside to present our documents. I noticed with alarm that one of the 2 offices had a sign that said Interpol Headquarters. I had a feeling that my presence in South America was now officially recognized. It was a rough mountainous country with very few inhabitants. Eventually we came to a fair-sized town lying in a mountainous plateau. I transferred onto a regular-sized diesel bus. Every seat was taken. Half a dozen people were sitting in the aisles. We had been traveling for hours and my throat was dry. I looked out the window in a hypnotic trance as we bounced up and down. Suddenly I could see a cloud of dust at right angles to the highway and several miles distance. I watched with curiosity as the cloud of dust got larger and closer. It turned out to be an army truck loaded with soldiers. They intercepted the bus and the soldiers jumped out of the truck and surrounded us with carefully held rifles. 2 officers came aboard the bus. One checked for documents and the other carelessly browsed amongst the luggage. After 15 minutes, the soldiers jumped back into the truck and we proceeded on our way. "What's happening?" I asked the old man beside me. He handed me a folded wanted poster. They were looking for a guerrilla who was responsible for kidnapping a cabinet minister the previous month. I looked about the bus and wondered who supported who. Quito was the capital of Ecuador on the Andean Plateau at an altitude of 9,000 feet. It was the largest city I had seen since Bogata, although it only had 500,000 people. The most impressive aspect of the city was definitely its architecture. Nothing in Europe could compare to it. Much has been made of Spain's lust for gold, but here is the beauty of its culture. It was in Quito that I first read of the Spanish conquest of the Incas. Spain had already conquered first the Carib Indians on the Caribbean islands, and then the Aztecs in Mexico. It took another few decades before the Spanish crossed the mainland in Central America and came down the Pacific coast. The Quechan Indians originated in what is now called Peru. Their empire stretched from the shores of Lake Titicaca in Bolivia to Quito in Ecuador. Quito was the summer seat of state as opposed to the royal court at Cusco. The chief of state and the living god of the people was the Inca. All relatives of the Inca were called Inca and formed the ruling nobility. When the Spaniards first landed in northern Peru, there were several violent confrontations with the coastal Indians. But other parties of Spaniards kept coming, lured by tales of fabulous cities of gold. This was partly true. Gold wasn't considered a currency, but a rare metal that was used exclusively for the royal family, much as a substitute for copper. The Spaniards sent word they were interested in meeting the Inca. The Inca was not only king, but also god. In his family history there are legends of fair-skinned gods who came from across the water from the east. It was more than idle curiosity which prompted him to question the runners who brought him news of the Spaniards' arrival. He invited the Europeans to visit him at his royal court in Cusco. The Spaniards demanded that he visit them. Such an order to the Inca ruler was simply unbelievable. It was inconceivable to him that these strangers should dare contradict him. Perhaps they were gods after all. His curiosity got the better of him, and he sent word to the Spaniards to expect him. Being a prudent man, he first ascertained their strength and took a correspondingly superior number of elite guards. Meanwhile, the Spaniards had conceived a plan of ambushing the guards and holding the Inca as hostage. Since he was their king and god, the hostile Indians would not dare to endanger his safety by attacking them. According to official history, a priest handed the Inca a Bible and insisted he pay homage to the Christian God. The Inca was properly insulted and threw the Bible on the ground. This is supposedly how the hostilities began. In any case, the Spaniards already had men secretly stationed in ambush, and their firearms cut down the Inca guards. The Inca was taken as hostage, and the Spaniards demanded a huge amount of gold as his ransom. When the gold was brought, they demanded more. It's easy to dismiss these historical heroes as kidnappers and bandits, but it wouldn't be entirely fair. They soon realized that the Inca was of more value as a hostage than the gold, and also that it was to their interest to see he was well treated and happy. The summer court of the Inca was at Quito, so that's where the Spaniards made their new capital. It had taken 4 days to travel from Popayan to Quito. I well deserved a 4-day rest stop in the Ecuadorian capital. Traveling to Lima, Peru down the coast would take another 4 to 5 days. The first stage was a bus to the border. It left Quito with a full load, but by nightfall there were only 3 of us on the bus, myself, an American, and his wife. There is very little traffic across the barren strip of no man's land, because officially Ecuador and Peru were still at war over the boundaries. The descent from the Andean Plateau to Ecuador's lush tropical rainforest was spectacular. Within a couple of hours the temperature had changed radically. Our clothes were now simply drenched with sweat. We were sitting on a bench outside the Ecuadorian customs post. Several armed soldiers lounged about in the equatorial heat, while a pompous officer disappeared with our passports. The mosquitoes were simply awful. We were being eaten alive. For the first time I regretted not taking malaria pills. I'm not sure what started the argument. The pompous official came back with the American's passport. I presume he wanted some small fee that the American interpreted as a bribe. We had been up for about 16 hours. The mosquitoes were driving us crazy, and tempers were at the exploding point. The American aggressively refused to pay, and the official started shouting at him in Spanish. The American lost his temper and started swearing at him in English. For a moment it seemed they would actually come to blows. It put me in a very tricky situation. There were only 6 of us, 3 South American soldiers, the American, his wife, and myself. I was shocked at the American. Even though I sympathized with his frustration, he was behaving like a complete asshole. If he wasn't careful, he would wind up getting us all hurt. It's a good thing none of the soldiers spoke English, because if they did, it would have provoked bloodshed. I stepped in to cool off the American. I had to. What shocked me more than anything else was the sudden explosion of racial hatred. Of course, I was on the American side. The 3 soldiers didn't give me any choice. We spent an uneasy night resting on our sleeping bags, waiting for dawn so we could walk across no man's land to the other side. In Ecuador, the coast is a tropical rainforest. In Peru, the coast is a burning desert. The change takes place over a relatively short distance. It's one of the most sharply delineated climatic borders in the world. It was almost as if the Ecuadorians had bribed God to turn off the taps. In reality, it is the Humboldt Current which is responsible for the contrast. The Humboldt Current is a cold ocean current of the South Pacific which flows north along the coast of Chile and Peru. As the prevailing winds blow in off the ocean, the cold dry air warms up and absorbs moisture. The winds continue to absorb moisture as they travel inland until they meet the foothills of the Andes Mountains. Then the air is forced to rise in altitude, cool off, and loses its capacity to hold moisture. Then it rains and vegetation sprouts again. The strip of land between the ocean and the mountains is one of the driest deserts in the world. It is sparsely populated, and the only villages are on the bank of the occasional river which collects water from the mountains and returns it to the sea. There are a few small fishing villages scattered along the coast. They earn their livelihood from the ocean and carry fresh water for long distances. These fishing villages sit on some of the nicest beaches in the world. I watched for hotels or some sign of tourism, but there wasn't any. For all practical purposes, the world had forgotten that these villages existed. If one is attracted by isolated sand beaches, roaring ocean surf, 365 days a year of warm sunshine, and extremely cheap food and real estate, then this may be the ideal place to retire. Lima, by contrast, was a vibrant city of 2.5 million people. I checked into a hotel recommended by long-haired travelers and took a shower. The dirt and grime of 5 days on the road was washed away, and I sank in the sinful luxury of a feather mattress. There were half a dozen foreign guests in the hotel, and they gave me valuable hints on what to expect in the future. Apparently it was Cusco that was the popular in-place in South America. It was the seat of Inca civilization, and cocaine was only $10 a gram. It was regarded as foolish to go to Bolivia because it was almost impossible to obtain drugs, and almost 100 European and American youths were spending 15 years in prison for drug offenses. The American government gave the Bolivian government a bounty of $5,000 US for every gringo they convicted on drug charges. One of the guests was an Irishman. He was a likable rogue who had just lost his traveler's checks and was flogging them on the black market. I turned him on to the last of some grass oil that I brought with me from Colombia, and in return he gave me a bag of about a quarter pound of coca leaves and a small bag of lime. The Inca and Indian tradition was to put a small piece of lime mineral in the mouth and chew a mouthful of coca leaves. The lime and saliva interacted with the juice of the leaves to release the cocaine alkaloid. I tried it, but chewing coca leaves soon becomes as boring as chewing gum. After half an hour, all I had was sore jaws and a mild benzodrine-type high. One could see why the Incas, traveling long distances on foot in the mountains, would find a drug which gave bursts of energy and reduced hunger a useful tool. But I much prefer cannabis. But I much prefer cannabis myself. There was too much to see in Lima in a few days, so I decided to stay for 2 weeks. One of the first things I noted was that most of the men carried purses, or should I say wallets. Their tight-fitting designer slacks had no pockets, so they carried a leather wallet by wrapping the leather thongs around the wrist. The other startling observation was the relaxed, warm, and sensual nature of the city's inhabitants. Lima was a city for lovers. These people knew how to have fun with a natural, friendly manner. There was little of the tension that was so obvious in Colombia and Ecuador. Everywhere couples would stroll casually down the street holding hands. Every night as the sun cooled down and the evening breeze brought the fragrance of blossoms, lovers would sit on the stone steps of the library and neck with abandon. This spell of youth and love had nothing to do with the grosser aspects of prostitution. There were several popular discos in the red light zone, and they were well promoted by small boys handing out flyers. The shops in the main streets gave off an air of prosperity, and the well-dressed youth exuded confidence and sensuality. Both the prosperity and the love stopped at the Rimac Bridge. This river, which flows through the center of Lima, separated the business and tourist districts from the slums. Crossing the bridge over the dry riverbed, which reduced the Rimac to a trickle, was like stepping into another world. There were several working-class taverns there, and since it was only a 10-minute walk from my hotel, I went there almost every night. At first there had been a strained atmosphere as they sized me up. It was not recommended for tourists to visit this section of town. One gringo drinking alone could almost be considered a provocation. However, I didn't want to go to a touristy bar. I wanted to meet the people. I've often encountered the suspiciousness of strangers and found the best solution was to relax in a what-the-hell attitude. Still, a bar isn't the worst place in the world to make friends. Show you have an appreciation for booze and a sense of humor with just a proper dash of curiosity, and you soon start meeting people. One of the first I met were two brothers who introduced me to drinking shandies, half beer and half ginger ale. I had a large capacity for beer and thought drinking ginger ale a waste of time, but soon found it didn't matter as much if you drank twice the amount. The Peruvian brothers kept up with me. It wasn't long before we had a nice buzz going. They confided they had been in Peru for 3 generations. Their grandfather had come from Italy. Mafiosa, they grinned in pride. One evening I was wandering aimlessly through the slums. You could sense a dissatisfaction in the air, but it was subtle, like the presence of an underground river. There were no overt signs of political activity. This was 1978. Within 5 years it would be a well-organized left-wing guerrilla force called the Shining Path. The only language I heard was Spanish. It was all the more surprising then to hear somebody singing a Beatles song called Eleni Rigby. I followed the music to its source and found 3 teenage Peruvians sitting on wooden boxes in an alley. One of them was strumming a guitar. When the singer had finished, I clapped my hands to show appreciation. He smiled and invited me to take a seat on an unoccupied wooden box. Between songs we began to chat. Strangely enough, the boys spoke hardly any English. This was surprising because their rendition of the English lyrics were exact. They had memorized the words. Every so often I hear people bemoan the fact that England has become a second-rate power. In a sense that is true, but only if you measure the power of an empire in armies, gold, and geophysical borders. In its cultural influence and spiritual leadership, England remains one of the world's major powers. These weren't Russian or Chinese songs that the youth of Peru were singing in alleys. No one was bribing or coercing them to memorize the lyrics. When the Queen of England gave the Beatles their OBE, Order of the British Empire, it was quite controversial. But in fact, it was post-recognition that the Beatles had become the major ambassadors of English culture. As the afternoon wore on, I became thirsty, and in order to show my appreciation for the concert, I bought some beer, which someone went to fetch from a nearby tavern. Since it was a Beatles concert, I offered to buy some pot as well. No pot, they informed me, only pasta. That sounded okay to me, so I shelled out a few more dollars for pasta. Someone came back with several folded pieces of waxed paper. It was a grayish-white powder, similar to the bogus cocaine I had bought in Bogata. The boys showed me how to sprinkle it on tobacco while rolling a cigarette. I lit it, inhaled, and passed it on like a joint. The effects were instantaneous. There was a rush similar to smoking pot, but the high was definitely speed or cocaine. It left a strange chemical aftertaste in the mouth. I certainly felt on top of the world and continued to feel that way for an hour or so. The come down was gradual, but similar to that of amphetamines. nothing that another joint of pasta didn't fix. Soon after that I met a pasta dealer in a downtown tavern. He was a youth in his early 20s and was well dressed and educated, but obviously wired from the look in his eyes. I was more interested in pot than pasta, but we dickered over a few beer, and I finally agreed to buy some of both. We took a downtown bus and transferred again in the suburbs. The neighborhood was distinctly Peruvian but clean. The plan was for me to wait in his parents' house while he did the deal. It was the inside of the house which came as a shock to me. The living room contained the largest, most expensive stereo I had ever seen. The carpets, the furniture, the color TV, all were impeccable taste and literally reeked of money. It was obvious that his family was in the upper middle class of Peruvian society. In that case, what was his son doing dealing dope? It turned out his father was an airplane pilot for the Peruvian National Airline. Twice a week he flew to Bolivia and back. My last weekend in Lima was Easter Sunday. For the past week there had been anticipation in the air. Buildings were painted, streets were swept clean, and tailors were exceptionally busy. It was obvious that the Easter Sunday parade was the main event of the year. All weekend the army had been drilling and marching to martial music in the armory. Their green olive-colored uniforms were lined up in perfect formation, but their rifles were conspicuously absent. The generals were top-heavy with medals and stood stiffly at attention while the soldiers goose-stepped around the square. On Easter Sunday the church bell started ringing and could be heard all over the city. I was standing in the plaza and already the crowds at the barrier were 4 and 5 people deep. You could hear the parade in the distance and the excitement mounted as it came closer. Leading the parade was a gold-leaf pelican borne on the shoulders of 4 monks. Inside the carriage was a flesh-colored icon of the Virgin Mary. The crowd wept hysterically and I could feel tears coming to my own eyes. In Silva I had witnessed the simple practice of Christianity amongst the Indians in a manner which seemed to represent Christianity at its birth as a religion. Here in Lima I was seeing Christianity as it had become several centuries later. The flourishing priesthood, the pomp and ceremony, the icons and rituals and crowd worship. It seemed a different form of Christianity, and yet it was the same. It still touched the hearts and souls of the people. All the Europeans and Peruvians I talked to told me to take the daily plane to Cusco. The bus service was non-existent. But there must be highways, I insisted. Well, sometimes, they admitted. There were roads into the mountains, and they did connect village to village, but sometimes they were closed because of bandits, and at other times roads could be washed out by floods or avalanches and closed for weeks at a time. That was just the sort of thing that got me interested. I went down to the terminal and bought a ticket for the first leg of the journey. I established that a bus left Lima 3 times a week. I also established there were connecting buses that eventually got to Cusco, but the ticket agent refused to estimate my time of arrival. From 4 days to 2 weeks is all I could get out of him. When the time came, I was fully prepared. I must have looked a sight in my straw Colombian sombrero, my bristling red beard, and my South American poncho. Inside I was well fortified with pasta, pot, and a potent Peruvian liqueur called pisco. Soon after leaving Lima, the landscape became dry and dusty again. Villages were isolated, and the crops grown mostly where irrigation was available. All day they traveled in a southwest direction. Toward evening the villages became larger and more prosperous. Corn was growing as high as a man's chest, and trees were much more common. It was cooler when the sun went down, and I guessed we were getting into the foothills. I found a tavern, ate dinner, and started drinking beer. I had bought a blank notebook in Lima. Originally I intended to take notes on what I saw around me, but the muse of literature works in strange ways, and the notebook started to fill with poems. The second day was on a different bus, and it climbed steadily, if slowly in attitude. We only traveled for about 5 hours before stopping for the night at a medium-sized village. The bus, of course, was going back, but my inquiries confirmed that there was a local bus at dawn that would be going further into the mountains. It was a red sun that came over the horizon. I wandered down to the marketplace and drank a couple of coffees while the bus was being loaded. It looked like a relic from World War II, and I realized the driver was probably the owner of this one-vehicle bus line. The passengers had changed too. Gone were the students and commercial travelers. The men were leaner and scruffier. They used their rough, calloused hands for a living, and their was no doubt the living was hard. As the terrain grew more mountainous, the farms and gardens got smaller. Soon climate would play a factor as well. At lower altitudes you could get 2 or 3 crops a year. The growing time decreased in direct proportion to the rise in altitude. It was boring being jostled up and down in the confined seats of the bus. I was drinking pisco and rum on a regular basis, but I sensed it would have been unforgivable to light up a joint inside the bus. Fortunately, breakdowns happened on a reliable schedule. It was rare that we ran continuously for more than 4 hours. People groaned at the delay, but used the excuse to stretch their legs. I walked further than most and used the opportunity to smoke a joint. I doubt if I was fooling anyone. The bus broke down again in the middle of the night. I rose sleepily and made my way to the exit. It was cold and my breath condensed in front of me. It was also damp and I shivered underneath the poncho. The road was hugging the cliff. Thick patches of fog limited vision to about 50 yards. At first I was glad for the chance to exercise and stretch my legs, but it seemed like an hour had passed and we still weren't going anywhere. The bonnet of the bus was open and 3 or 4 men peered anxiously under the hood with a flashlight. The cold started to seep into my bones. I couldn't help wondering what the hell I was doing there anyways. I don't know how they fixed it, but they did. I can only conclude that Peru has some of the finest mechanics in the world. Everybody breathed a sigh of relief that we wouldn't be stuck there for 3 or 4 days awaiting spare parts. We climbed back on board the bus and huddled underneath our ponchos for warmth. I slept uneasily and woke up several times before dawn. When daylight came, I realized the ground was covered with snow. Mountain peaks rose majestically in the distance, but the nearby hills were gently sloping. I realized we must have reached the top of a pass. On a nearby hill, a dozen animals were grazing. They broke the snow with their hooves to uncover the meager grass underneath. I had never seen animals like this in my life. They resembled camels without humps. Of course, I presumed they were llamas, but when I tried to confirm this with the man in front of me, he told me they were vicuna. I had seen pictures of llamas, and they seemed quite similar. The major difference was that llamas were considerably larger and were used as beasts of burden as well as for their wool. Vicuna were smaller and raised solely for their silky, soft fleece. The next village we came to was poorer and meaner than the ones that had come before. We were well above the tree line and wood was at a premium. Even the small inn we stopped at was unbearably cold. Everyone was wrapped up in multiple layers of clothing. The faces of the villagers were aloof and unexpressive. Their skin was wrinkled and weather-beaten. It was difficult to avoid comparison with Sherpa villages in Nepal. It was the same kind of climate and geography, but in Nepal they had yaks instead of llamas, and wheat instead of corn. Also the Nepalese were Buddhists, and had a friendlier, more open culture. The washroom facilities consisted of an outhouse. You can tell a lot about a civilization by its washrooms. Most of the Western world supplies toilet paper. Most of Asia provides a tap or a can of water. Peru, unfortunately, supplies neither. Not that it has to be perfumed rolls or anything as exotic as that. An Eaton's catalog or a newspaper will do, but there has to be something. The few shops had very little on their shelves. The stores in Lima overflowed with consumer goods, but there was no money to pay for them. We stopped in a cafe for breakfast where I had coffee and eggs. I bought a bottle of rum for $1 and a Coke to mix with it. When I paid the owner, she charged me $1 for the Coca-Cola. I suspected that she was overcharging me because I was a gringo and completely lost my temper. I appealed to my fellow passengers, but they backed away from getting involved. In retrospect, I felt quite ashamed. I was making quite a lot of fuss over $1. In a throwaway society, an empty bottle is quite insignificant and the deposit very low. It's conceivable that in this village, the deposit was very high. I also recognized that they were fighting for the bare necessities of survival, and the temptation to overcharge a tourist could be overwhelming. It wasn't the dollar, but the principle of the thing. I expect to be treated like any other person, and resented being discriminated against because of my race. It took 8 days to reach Cusco. We arrived at night in a drizzling rain. I walked through the cobblestone streets with my knapsack over my shoulder and rain dripping from the rim of my hat. I took a room at the first pension I came across and dumped my knapsack on the floor. After drying off, I put my poncho back on and went seeking beer and entertainment. A European at the hotel had recommended a disco. I'm not sure what I expected, but I was pleasantly surprised. It was furnished in good taste without being garish. There was a largely international, sophisticated cafe-type audience. The best surprise of all was the band. It was a Peruvian group of talented young musicians. Somehow they combined the ancient Incan folklore with an avant-garde Santana-like interpretation. The major instruments were flutes, cymbals, and drums. The flutes in particular played exceptionally haunting refrains which reminded me of Simon and Garfunkel. Now at least I knew where Simon and Garfunkel had taken their inspiration from. This was a top quality band that would get rave reviews in New York, London, or Paris. Suddenly I noticed members of the audience looking towards the door. I glanced casually in that direction and saw two heavy-set men standing at my table. Ignoring them, I took another long pull at my beer. I'm not certain what it is, but sometimes I seem to attract narcs and secret police like honey does flies. Sure enough, the next time I looked up, they were standing right in front of me. Passport, they demanded. All of a sudden, the music stopped and the clang of a cymbal died into silence. Canadian, I grunted, and shoved my passport across the table. Mind if I have a cigarette? The second one asked. At that moment, the owner of the club intervened. What do you want? He demanded. This man is a friend of mine. If you wish to talk to him, you can wait outside. Can I have a cigarette? The second man repeated. I nodded my assent, and he opened the package and dumped it on the table. Fortunately, my pot was in my boot. Just then, the band started chanting, Colombia, Colombia, Colombia. Pretty soon, the audience joined in. The plainclothes police looked around in resentment and headed towards the door. Cusco has a magic which makes it unique. Part of it may be its altitude. It is definitely a mountain town, and mountains have a high psychic energy. The relationship between philosophers and mountains is as old as history. Mountains give isolation and time to meditate. Mountains represent the forces of nature at their most extreme. Mountains also provide a different physical viewpoint. Sometimes it is difficult to see the forest for the trees, but when you're on a mountain, you can look down into a village from a different perspective. The Inca civilization was highly advanced when discovered by the Spaniards. Their spoken language was extremely complex, but they had no written characters. Instead, they communicated on an abstract basis by tying colored and knotted cords to a base rope called a quipu. This was used to calculate and record numbers and convey information. Quipu could be stored like books for future reference. Their knowledge of mathematics was incredibly advanced. Inca ruins show they were familiar with building techniques that we can only imagine today. It is highly unlikely that they were built with brute force, since their design has a mathematical relationship to astronomy. Any civilization which can plot the orbits of planets, chart the position of stars, and predict the return of comets ranks as one of the greatest civilizations of the human race. In some ways, Cusco was the Rome of the Holy Empire, and the Europeans were the barbaric Vandals which destroyed the things they couldn't understand. How well developed was the astronomy of the Inca civilization? We can only guess. But in the 1960s, planes flying over the Andes took aerial photographs that revealed a series of immense landscaped fields. Stone walls confirmed that indeed the fields were man-made, but there is no evidence of either agriculture or nearby ancient cities to motivate farming on that scale. The conclusion of many scholars is that the fields were no less than a landing strip. On the ground level there is no discernible pattern to the fields and stone walls. They seem haphazardly arranged, and without reason or purpose. It is only from an altitude of several thousand feet that a distinct man-made pattern became intelligible. The inescapable conclusion is that this landing strip was designed to be visible from several thousand feet in the air, yet there is no evidence of the technological industry in Inca culture that would enable them to build and fly airplanes. If the people who designed this landing strip weren't from this world, they must have been from outer space. Is it conceivable that intelligent life forms exist in this universe, and they have visited Earth on previous occasions, and imparted some of their knowledge of astronomy and mathematics? Some people think so. Gurdjieff isn't a favorite philosopher of mine. I feel he's egocentric and abstruse. But I once visited the same valley in northwest Pakistan where he had gone to study Tibetan Buddhism. Apparently he believed that Earth has been visited by human life forms from the Drog star. Gurdjieff himself doesn't mention this, but Aleister Crowley claims that Gurdjieff was a prime mover behind the mystical order of the Golden Dawn, and that the Sirius legend was a secret known only to its highest initiates. That such a belief should range from mountain lamaseries in Asia to obscure Christian cults in Europe is cause for wonder. If this legend was also part of the Inca heritage in South America, then it is no longer coincidence, but a common theme surfacing in most of the world's religions. My first few days in Cusco were spent sightseeing, but it became obvious that I was not in good health. Although I was eating and drinking regularly, I had been constipated for several days, and was getting an uncomfortable bloated feeling. This was complicated by an infection on the lip of the rectum, which made it extremely painful to walk. I suspected that the infection came from using a used piece of paper in an outhouse. Eventually I went to a government clinic. They didn't speak English and showed no desire to be helpful. I wound up prescribing myself a laxative to restore regularity and antibiotics to fight the infection, and codeine to dull the pain. I don't suppose my drinking was helping much. I usually woke near dawn, but started drinking beer at noon and continued all evening until I went to bed. It didn't seem to be unusual to me at all, since that's the way I'd been living in Canada for the past 5 years. Bars were a good place to meet people, but I was giving my liver an awful beating. Almost all the Europeans I met were using cocaine to some extent. It was becoming a very popular drug back home, and here it was excellent quality and readily available for $10 per gram. Since pot was extremely scarce, and most travelers smoked as well, it was easy for me to gain their confidence. Cocaine was selling for something like $3,000 to $5,000 per kilo. It was customary to put up half the money in advance. Then a dealer would travel to La Paz, Bolivia, pick up a kilo, and bring it back to Cusco. True, it was only $7 per gram in La Paz, Bolivia, and only $4 per gram in Santa Cruz where they refined it. Unfortunately, the internal machinations of the cocaine wars made it impossible for an outsider to go there to score. Since the U.S. government paid the authorities $5,000 for busting gringos on drug charges, it was economically more feasible for a Bolivian to turn you in for the reward than it was to sell you coke. Of course, you could buy your way out for $30,000, but unless you had that kind of cash around, you were in over your head. The highlight to any trip to the Andes is a visit to the Inca ruins at Machu Picchu, about 50 miles northwest of Cusco. These ruins were only recently discovered. How did they remain secret from the Spaniards for so long? It's partly explained by its remote location in the wilderness of the Urubamba Valley. It was obviously a secret fortress where the Inca, his wives and children, and his personal bodyguard could flee in extreme danger. The ruins are well preserved. They consist of ground embankments and stone buildings where huge blocks of rock, often weighing tons, were fitted together so accurately it was difficult to pry a knife blade between them. Where did these huge building blocks come from? They were not mined locally. How were they transported up a river when it was difficult for people to climb the desolate cliffs in single file? Many questions have never been answered. You might as well ask the wind as it blows over the desolate ruins. The wind will exist forever, even after the rocks have worn and crumpled into dust. The flute is a wind instrument. It is the only musical instrument that can express the soul of the Inca. There weren't any accommodations at the ruins, but there is a hostel a couple of miles away. As usual, there are about half a dozen Americans and Europeans staying for the night. It seemed all of us had come for the same reasons: curiosity and snow. Everybody had a gram or two of blow, and I had some smoke. We simply laid out one line after another, and pretty soon we were flying high as a condor. It was then that somebody suggested we visit the Inca baths before dark. Apparently there is a hot sulfur spring about a mile over a trail. It had been there at least since the 1500s, because the Incas had laid stone tiles and converted it to an open-air bath, used exclusively by the Inca and his wives. This wasn't an opportunity to be turned down. We timed our arrival for sunset so we could go skinny dipping. There were 3 men and 2 women. The water was warm and relaxing. Once your nostrils adjusted to the pungent sulfur smell, it was like being in heaven. The stars came out and it was distinctly cool outside of the water. My friends went back to the hotel with the only flashlight, but I opted to spend the night at the pool. The cocaine kept my mind alert and erasing, while the warm, caressing currents lulled my muscles to sleep. I wondered if this was the legendary source of the fabled fountain of youth that Ponce de Leon spent his life looking for. For one night I could be the Inca, and I wished it would never end. Chapter 3, Bolivia. My next destination was Copacabana, a resort town on the Bolivian side of Lake Titicaca. At an altitude of 12,500 feet, this is generally considered the highest freshwater lake in the world. The boundary between Peru and Bolivia cuts the lake in half, which leads the Peruvians to claim that all the titi is in Peru and all the caca in Bolivia. In Bolivia they have the same joke, but the roles are reversed. It had been another grueling 2-day bus ride from Cusco, and like many of the others I donned a pair of faded cut-off jeans and headed for the beach. The lake was placid and perfectly calm. In some ways it resembled a gigantic mirror that had been placed on top of the mountain so that the only thing it could reflect would be a solitary cloud drifting silently across the biosphere. It was a typical mountain climate, warm during the day and cool at night. Lying in the sand in the hot glare of the sun, it was easy to forget this. The reminder came when you plunged in the clear, chilling waters. In spite of the temperature, I enjoyed myself. It was the first time I'd been swimming since Santa Marta in Colombia. Copacabana was a strange town. It was too large for a village and too small for a town. It seemed to have multiple facets to its personality. It was rumored to be the site of a pre-Inca civilization. The ancestors, in fact, of the Inca Empire centered in Cusco. Their descendants were still living on Lake Titicaca. They built reed huts on floating reed islands and fished for their livelihood from reed boats. There were more stone ruins in the hills for those in search of the lost archaeological grail. The town was also a Christian shrine. The church had been here for 400 years, and if they changed the Indian, then it's also true that the Indian changed the church. Nominally it was Roman Catholic, but it had a distinct Indian flavor. The patron saints were Indian, the history of the church was Indian. Bolivia stands alone amongst the South African nations in that it was never fully conquered by the Europeans. It was invaded and exploited but proved to be unrulable. In all of the other countries, the Indian has remained a peasant, while the political and financial affairs of state have been manipulated by an upper class of white Spanish descendants. In Bolivia, this white oligarchy never established its foothold. Bolivia pays the price in the lack of a highly educated civil service and the lack of industrial development. However, it has maintained its independence. Bolivia is changing too and entering the 20th century. The streets of Copacabana show the contrast between the rural Indians who live there and the sharply dressed secretaries and engineers who have come from La Paz to enjoy a holiday in an increasingly popular resort town. It took another bus ride to get to La Paz, but this time it was an air-conditioned tourist bus. La Paz is a modern industrial city of 500,000 people and is usually the administrative capital of Bolivia. The official political capital is Sucre. However, it is Santa Cruz that refines the coca leaves into cocaine. Bolivia has only 2 major exports, tin and cocaine. In the last 10 years, it has been cocaine that earns the major portion of the country's foreign exchange. This economic reality has been reflected in its domestic politics. For the past decade, there has been revolution and counter-revolution in a series of military coups that swing the balance of power between the financial oligarchy in La Paz, supported with American foreign aid and cash bribes from the American Federal Drug Agency, and and the financial oligarchy in Santa Cruz that controls the export of cocaine. The politicians govern with the consent of the military, and the military sells its services to whoever has the most money. Corruption is so endemic where the major industry is the underground economy that transcends all racial, political, and geographical lines. La Paz itself is a city of contrasts. It has more hills than San Francisco, but everything is crowded together as if in the pocket of the mountains. One widely paved boulevard contains skyscrapers and office towers. A few blocks over, factories were belching out raw pollution. Just down the street was the old Indian market. Here the Indians sold their handicrafts, jewelry, and food. Both the men and women alike wore somber black clothing. Most of the women wore a black bowler hat, black vest, and gray skirt. The best bargains were silver spoons. They were handcrafted by silversmiths and had no purity markings, but some of them would be worth a fortune in New York or San Francisco. I chose a quiet hotel not far from one of the main plazas. In the daytime I scoured the streets. In the evenings I took my notebook and pen to a local bar and wrote poetry while getting drunk on the excellent Bolivian beer. The beer was surprisingly good. No doubt it had something to do with the best of the German brewmasters immigrating to South America after the Second World War. In the first week I met a dozen European travelers. They were all looking for coke but couldn't find any. Strangely enough, the one place it was readily available was the foreigners' prison. There are almost 100 European prisoners doing 15-year sentences on drug charges. Naturally, they had to buy their own food and clothing. Naturally, the only way they could make money inside was by selling coke. The prison authorities encouraged foreign visitors. While they were visiting, they could use cocaine freely, and if they're brave enough, they could smuggle out a few grams. Spot searches on leaving the prison were infrequent. One wonders how the drug dealing at the prison could be so blatant, when in the rest of the city it was so restricted. The answer was obvious in a crude sort of way. The prison authorities made money from selling the prisoners cocaine and selling them food and clothing that they bought with money obtained from visitors. On the other hand, the American Federal Drug Enforcement Agency was also happy. They were quite aware that a goodly portion of Bolivia's tourists would be eager to try the cocaine. By letting them do it at the prison, the agency would be able to keep track of who was interested in cocaine and at the same time give a severe example of what happens to American entrepreneurs who decide to do a little business on their own. One night I went to the movies. They were very popular in both Lima and La Paz. Sometimes it seems that the harsher reality is, the more people are interested in escapism and romance. This particular evening the movie was called Mandingo. It was an excellent book that I had read several years previously, but I had never seen it on the screen. The theme was interracial love and human jealousy. It must have moved me because when I left the theater I had tears in my eyes. I couldn't help thinking of Seagull, how much I loved her and how much I missed her. It had been raining and the cobblestone streets reflected neon signs and car headlights. I went to a local tavern and quickly drank a few quarts, but it didn't do anything to cure the pain in my heart. When I got back to my hotel, I wrote Seagull a letter. I told her I loved her and asked her to marry me. I'd only be staying in La Paz a week, so I asked her to send me her reply to Rio de Janeiro. If her answer was yes, I'd come straight back to Toronto. If her answer was no, then there was nothing to return for. In that case, I would stay in Brazil. In ancient times, it was accepted knowledge that it was the stars which governed the affairs of men. I think I agree, but it's not the stars in heaven I'm thinking of, but the stars in the eyes of their lovers. Sociologists have often commented on the matriarchal aspects of Bolivian culture. What it means basically is that the woman wears the pants in the family. It is the woman that feeds the chickens and harvests the corn. It is the woman that does the cooking and bears the children. What does the man do? Well, he's good at drinking and gambling, and of course he has certain biological uses. But in Indian culture, it is the woman who makes the decisions. It was never better illustrated than an experience I had in a working-class tavern. It was a random choice. I simply wanted to rest my legs and slake my thirst. As usual, being the only gringo present caused some consternation, but after a few quarts of beer, their wariness turned to curiosity. One woman was sitting at a table with 3 men. She was all woman, all right, all 250 pounds of her. Still, it was more than just physical presence. She had a liveliness and willpower that seemed to dominate the room. Soon her curiosity got the better of her and she asked me to join their table. Not wanting to be unfriendly, I pulled up a chair. As usual, language was no barrier to people of goodwill. We made jokes, misunderstood each other, and laughed uproariously. When I looked into her eyes, I saw amusement, and if I wasn't mistaken, just a touch of lust. I'm afraid we dominated the conversation. Two of the other men left, leaving one small, innocuous man. From the way they started arguing, it became obvious that they were married, and he wanted her to leave. I began to feel a little uncomfortable. I had no desire to be knifed in a jealous rage. Apparently she won because her husband left her alone. Being a gentleman, I bought her a beer. About an hour later, two kids, about 9 or 10 years old, came in and started tugging at her arm to take her home. She still refused to go, but I just couldn't do that to a couple of kids. They won. It had been a month since Seagull and I had separated, and I felt miserable. How much of that was pure horniness, I couldn't really say. One night I was at a disco and met a couple of girls. After chatting them up for a while, I came directly to the point and offered one of them $10 to go to bed with me. She agreed, and we walked hand in hand to a hotel. After my last experience in Colombia, I didn't know what to expect. She certainly was beautiful. She was in her early 20s and had raven black hair, erect nipples, and a slim waist. I stripped and we locked together on the bed. It was the pure animal lust for a stranger. One thing I had learned about prostitutes is that I was strictly in business with them. They weren't interested in your prowess as a lover, only in how much time you took. I took her savagely, concerned only with my own pleasure. Afterwards we smoked a cigarette, and I was about to turn on my side and go to sleep when she tapped me lightly on the shoulder. Again she smiled. One of the friends I made was a Brazilian artist from Rio de Janeiro. He met me while I was writing poetry, so we had a common bond between us. We spoke Portuguese, but got along in Spanish a lot better than I did. He spoke Portuguese, but got along in Spanish a lot better than I did. It was through him that I managed to buy some cocaine. It cost me $50 for 7 grams. Immediately I took it back to my hotel. I did a couple of lines and it practically blew my head off. It was pure and uncut. I enjoy cocaine, but one of the unpleasant side effects was paranoia. Considering the political climate for drug users in Bolivia, there is good reason to be paranoid. I chopped up another couple of lines and stashed the rest in the washroom down the hall. I must have did quite a few more lines. To make a long story short, I must have sniffed several grams. The more cocaine I did, the more paranoid I became. The more paranoid I became, the more cocaine I did, with the reasonable assumption the sooner it was gone, the safer I'd be. I must have overdosed, because the last thing I remember is laying stretched out in bed, unable to move. My toes went numb, and I realized I had lost all muscular control. I lost my paranoia and was only faintly irritated because this wasn't the way I had planned to go. It was a long night, but sometime the next morning I regained muscular control. It was an effort to sit up and walk. My head was still buzzing, and even though I couldn't possibly eat anything, I decided to go out for a hot coffee. Each step I took seemed to be in slow motion. I hadn't realized how steep the hills were in La Paz. I had only gone about a block before I had to sit down. My chest was heaving wildly as if I was having a heart attack. Slowly I went back to the hotel, hoping I'd learned my lesson from this one. If it was difficult to buy cocaine, it was even more difficult to export. The Bolivian customs and dealers were more than a little eager to collect a little extra reward money, and they knew most of the tricks. But it wouldn't make a dent in the big-time cocaine traffic. But the small-time dealers were sacrificial lambs, and heavy prison sentences kept the dealing exclusive and the prices high. A lot of people have tried swallowing condoms, but it's extremely risky. Every year, half a dozen people die of heart attacks after a condom breaks and they absorb a massive overdose of cocaine. Strangely enough, one method highly recommended by everyone was to glue 1 gram of cocaine between 2 postcards. If done correctly, it looks like a single postcard and escapes the scrutiny that they give envelopes. This method has another advantage. If it is intercepted back in Canada or the United States, it's in the best interest of the judicial system simply to confiscate it. To press importing charges, spend thousands of dollars on a trial, and support somebody in prison for 7 years over a single gram of coke is simply ridiculous. They have bigger fish to catch. On the other hand, there isn't any guarantee. If they wanted to stick it to you, they can give you 7 years to life. Speaking for myself, I decided it wasn't worth it. I still had 3 grams left, and I was still curious. Despite everyone's advice, I decided to go to Santa Cruz. By now, I was used to sleeping on buses. I woke up once during the night. I was cold and wrapped the poncho tightly around me. The bus wound its way cautiously around mountain curves. I peered out the mud-splattered windows and saw everything was covered with snow. It meant we must have been traversing the spine of the Andes. By morning it was much warmer and the snow had disappeared. We must have descended in altitude because we were back below the tree line. It was then I discovered my hat was missing. The straw sombrero I had worn all the way from Colombia. I searched all around my seat and gazed suspiciously at every passenger on the bus. It was no good. Whoever took it must have gotten off at one of the mountain villages during the night. The end of the line was a medium-sized village called Cochabamba. Cochabamba was a market town which serviced the outlying Indian villages. Once a week they brought their produce to the town square and returned home with the necessities of life. It had rained that morning and the sky was still dismal. The shops had wooden sidewalks, but the streets themselves were a sea of mud. I was glad I was wearing boots. Most of the Indians simply removed their sandals and walked barefoot. There was a predictable assortment of vegetables in the market stalls. There were sacks of grain and a few butchers selling mostly chickens. One stall sold cheap watches and transistor radios. However, at least a third of the stalls were lined up with bales of coca leaves. These bales were as high as a man's shoulders, and each one contained 200 pounds of coca leaves. If 10 bales equaled 1 ton, then the corrugated sheet iron roof of the marketplace must have covered 10 to 15 tons of coca leaves. I tried to imagine what this would be worth in New York or Montreal, but without success. The bus for Santa Cruz left at noon. It was twilight when we got there. We had been descending in altitude for several hours. The terrain became flatter and the vegetation almost tropical. The huts along the highway looked more prosperous, but nothing I'd yet seen could prepare me for Santa Cruz. Within 10 miles, I passed from the abject poverty of rural South America to the middle-class prosperity of Southern California. I could hardly believe my eyes. The roads were paved with asphalt, and they had sewers, fire hydrants, and concrete sidewalks. The houses were California-type bungalows, with red-tiled roofs, green lawns, and flowering gardens. A few blocks from the bus station, I found a reasonable but clean pension and deposited my knapsack. The journey from La Paz had exhausted me. I took a shower and slept between clean sheets. In the morning I couldn't help wondering if what I'd seen was only a dream. It wasn't. It was for real. True, there was the odd peasant that reminded you were in Bolivia, but almost all the people on the street were dressed in the same stylish clothing that could be seen in any North American city. The cars, jeeps, and motorbikes were practically new. The shop windows were filled with the most appliances and goods. The shop's windows were filled with the most modern appliances and goods. Expensive stereos, tape recorders, camera equipment, and even telescopes gave the impression that there was more money around than people knew what to do with. The people didn't look Indian. They looked like they were Spanish. Also noticeable was the absence of hippies, or bearded travelers with knapsacks. The town wasn't that large. Its population was only 100,000 people. I don't really know what I expected. A Sin City of brothels and bars, perhaps? Not a chance. There was nothing to indicate this was the cocaine capital of the world. Only money. Walking down one residential street, I noticed 2 men playing chess in a garden alcove. The game has always fascinated me, so risking their indignation, I strolled over and indicated I would like to sit down and watch. They only spoke Spanish, so communication was at a minimum. They didn't seem too enthusiastic at the interruption, but gestured to me to sit down out of politeness. They were fairly good players, and their initial reserve about my intrusion disappeared when it became obvious that I respected the game enough to refrain from commenting or otherwise disturbing them. It was a close game, and the winner challenged me. I accepted with larceny. After the first few opening moves, I realized I had a worthy opponent, and it was going to be a long, hard struggle. As we played for our position, our respect for each other grew, and our concentration deepened. There was more than just a game involved. We were representing our respective nations and cultures. It was an intense struggle. It wasn't to the end game that I was able to press home a pawn advantage to an ultimate checkmate. The amazing thing was that chess transcended all language barriers. By the end of the game, we seemed to know each other quite well. We shook hands in mutual friendship, and they invited me back the next day. I never did see them again. Unfortunately, not all Bolivians were so friendly to gringos. Later that afternoon, I was sitting on a park bench when two strangers approached. They sat down and tried to engage me in conversation. After the usual preliminaries, they asked me if I wanted to buy any cocaine, only $4 per gram. I still had a couple of grams left back at my room, so I wasn't particularly anxious, but agreed to snort some with them. After one of the men left to score while the other one stayed to talk. After a minute, the man sitting beside me warned me not to buy any. He indicated his friend talking to a man in a sports jacket. He's talking to the police, my companion warned me. If you buy any, they will arrest you. I looked into his eyes and realized he was telling me the truth. Thanks, I said warmly, and left the park as quickly as I could. One of the men left to score while the other one stayed to talk. After a minute, the man sitting beside me warned me not to buy any. He indicated his friend talking to a man in a sports jacket. He's talking to the police, my companion warned me. If you buy any, they will arrest you. I looked into his eyes and realized he was telling me the truth. Thanks, I said warmly, and I left the park as quickly as I could. After a couple of blocks, I went into a bar with a window facing the street. I didn't want to go back to my room until I was sure I wasn't being followed. It was a small, dingy bar with a dozen chairs and a couple of pool tables. I ordered a quart bottle of beer and poured myself a glass. The men playing pool started a heated argument. My Spanish was very poor, but I think I caught the drift of what was being said. One of the men said I was an American hippie and obviously looking for drugs. He said he had a brother in the police and knew how to make some money. The other man was defending me. He said I was minding my own business and should be left alone. He wanted to get back to the pool game. The first man insisted they could make $500 and asked the bartender if he could use the phone. He was still talking when I rose from the table, leaving a half-finished beer behind me, and went out the door. I had been warned not to go to Santa Cruz, and now I knew why. I resolved to go straight back to my room and leave for Argentina in the morning. The train was noisy and crowded. I bought a third-class ticket to Yacuba, a small town on the frontier. It was a milk run, and the third-class wooden seats meant an uncomfortable journey. The passengers were farmers and rural workers, far more simply dressed than the sophisticated citizens of Santa Cruz. The train lurched into motion, and I must admit I felt a certain sense of relief as we left the city limits. The countryside was new and refreshing, although it soon became drier with the more familiar barren poverty of Bolivia. The third-class coach was an ancient wooden affair of the sort you saw in Western movies. It resembled something I once saw in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The two passengers opposite me wore threadbare, dusty suits. One was a school teacher, the other was an accountant. Both worked in small villages near the border. I was practicing my Spanish when the door of the coach opened and two men stepped inside. Both men were obviously police, although they were in plain clothes. Beginning at the front of the coach, they began to systematically check the identity papers of each passenger. I was uncomfortably aware I was the only gringo on the train. It also occurred to me I still had a couple of grams of cocaine in my shirt pocket. When the police officer got around to me and demanded my passport, I responded quickly. He studied the passport carefully and asked me a series of questions in rapid-fire Spanish. I explained the best I could that I had flown from Toronto to Miami, Miami to Colombia, and had come down the west coast of South America by bus. A lot of other questions followed that I didn't really understand. The longer I took to answer, the more excited he got. Finally, he announced I was under arrest and confiscated my passport. Rule number one when traveling in foreign countries is to never let your passport out of your sight. With it, you are a Canadian citizen. Without it, you could rot in jail for the rest of your life. Rule number two is not to get shot trying to get it back. I tried to keep my cool, and after a decent interval, made my way to the washroom of the train and disposed of the cocaine. I threw it out the window instead of snorting it. The penalty for possession of drugs in Bolivia was 15 years. By the time I got back to my seat, I wished I had done a line instead of throwing it away. There are few things more depressing than being under arrest in a foreign country. The school teacher and accountant sitting opposite me were sympathetic. Apparently, the police suspected my passport was a forgery. The school teacher was especially sympathetic. After a couple hours of commiseration, he agreed to go speak to the police officer on my behalf. Not a mean gesture, considering Klaus Barbie, the Nazi war criminal they called the Butcher of Lions, was chief advisor to the secret police. I stared moodily out the window, awaiting his return. The landscape was shrub and desert again. I briefly considered jumping from the train, but quickly dismissed the idea. Eventually the teacher returned and explained the policeman knew the passport was no good because it didn't have an exit stamp from Canada or the United States. I insisted that we didn't need exit stamps to leave our country. The teacher shrugged miserably and said the police had agreed to return my passport for a bribe of $10. I gave him the $10 and thanked him profusely when he returned a little later with my passport. Apparently the policeman still suspected the validity of my passport. I hadn't seen him for the rest of the long, nerve-wracking journey, but as soon as I stepped out of the coach at Cuba, he and his henchmen were right behind me and followed me closely to the Bolivian border post. He conferred with a senior officer who laughed and came over to me to apologize. The policeman who had arrested me was a junior-level detective from Santa Cruz, had been promoted to a new posting at the border. Apparently he had honestly found it inconceivable that some countries don't require their citizens to get exit permits. The policeman grudgingly apologized, but I noticed he didn't return my bribe. Chapter 4, Argentina. My original intention had been to stay overnight at Yuqueba, but I had no wish to stay any longer in Bolivia. Hitching my knapsack over my shoulder, I walked across no man's land to Argentina. The difference was noticeable. Their immigration officer was better kept and newly painted. The soldiers wore sharper uniforms. "Ah, Canadian," the officer said as he took my passport. He eyed me up and down. "Cowboy boots?" he asked with raised eyebrows. "Keeps the mud out," I explained. "Why have you come to Argentina? The World Cup?" The international soccer finals were to be held in Buenos Aires that year. I'm not a soccer fan, but it sounded like a good excuse. "The World Cup," I said, agreeing with him. "Welcome to Argentina," he said with a broad smile. "Just take your knapsack over there," he said, indicating a shed in the distance. "It's just a formality." As with a sigh of relief, I wandered over the customs shed. It was good to be back in a friendly country. The relief disappeared when I entered the office itself. The two officers behind the counter were arrogant and brusque. "Put your knapsack on the counter. Take off your clothes." I had the sinking feeling I had just jumped from the frying pan into the fire. I disrobed under their cold, cynical stares. One of the officers noticed the marijuana tattoo on my arm. "What's that?" he said with a grin. "It's a maple leaf," I bluffed. "It's not like the maple leaves we have in Argentina," he said with a smirk. The other officer had emptied the contents of the knapsack on the counter. He searched every article of clothing with mechanical interest, but it was the books that caught his attention. "What are these?" he asked as he leafed through them. "They're mine," I said angrily. "I wrote them." "Ah, a writer," he said mockingly. "Watch who you talk to in our country. We don't like drug addicts or left-wing intellectuals." This wasn't the time to argue. I calmly put my clothes back on and slowly repacked my knapsack. All through Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia I had been taking buses. Other expatriates had told me it was possible to hitchhike in Argentina and Brazil. This was my original intention, but I thought it prudent to get away from the border area as quickly as possible and bought a bus ticket for Ambacion. I breathed another sigh of relief as the bus pulled away from the border, but this relief was short-lived as well. We had barely driven 100 miles before coming across a roadside army post. Two soldiers armed with pistols came on board and started checking identity cards. When they came to me, they asked me to get off the bus and follow them inside. The contents of my knapsack were dumped on the floor, and once again I was told to strip naked, bend over a desk, and spread my cheeks. My indignation was increased when I heard my bus pull away, but I had learned not to argue with the business end of a rifle. It's hard for me to explain the antagonism I felt towards authority of all kinds. It wasn't just a question of politics. By conscience I was a social democrat. However, my rugged brand of individualism demanded a high degree of free enterprise. Ideally, I suppose I am an anarchist, yet I am also a pacifist. The anarchism I believed in had nothing to do with political terrorism. Rather, it was based on the personal belief that the morality which governed men's actions must come from within his own soul. Government should exist to express the collective will of the people. Unfortunately, their primary purpose seemed to be protect the political and economic privileges of the ruling elite. North America in the 60s was undergoing a cultural revolution. In 1965, we thought we could change the world by turning on to LSD. We were actually naive enough to think that if somebody spiked the water supply of the United Nations with LSD, the delegates of all nations would undergo a spiritual revolution and return to their respective countries preaching brotherhood and love. That naivety didn't last very long. Most of the drug activists were sentenced to lengthy terms in prison. Psychedelic drugs remained illegal, and as their popularity grew, so did the vast amounts of money involved. The psychedelic gurus were replaced by dealers primarily concerned with accumulating money and power. A new sort of naivety emerged, the political revolutionary. The Black Panthers, the SLA, the FLQ were the new cultural heroes. All over North America, young university students were buying posters of Che Guevara and Mao's Little Red Book. However, what was fashionable in North America was dead serious in South America. The Peronist government in Argentina was accused of being both fascist and corrupt. Inflation was rampant. Communist-led labor unions went on strike for higher wages. The middle class was scared stiff by inflation and speculated against their own currency. Left-wing guerrilla activity increased. In Uruguay it was the Tupameros. In Argentina it was the Monteros. The Peronist government was incapable of stopping the violence. There was a military coup, and the Peronist government was replaced by a military junta. If things were bad under the Peronists, they were 1,000 times worse under the junta. The Army, Navy, and Air Force were at war with each other as well as the general population. Each branch of the services maintained their own secret police, and they began an unprecedented campaign of terror against political dissenters. Ordinary thugs, murderers, and thieves were no problem. They could always be persuaded to join the secret police. The real targets of the state were university students, trade unionists, journalists, teachers, doctors, social workers, and anyone who represented a potential challenge to the military dictatorship. Thousands and thousands of people simply disappeared, never to be heard of again. Some were taken to secret concentration camps where they were beaten and tortured. Many were simply kidnapped, executed in gangland-style slayings, and buried in unmarked graves. This campaign of terror was at its zenith when I traveled through Argentina in 1978. It was a dirty war, but it was also invisible. If the soldiers and police were unmistakably hostile, the general population seemed more than friendly. Hitchhiking was no more difficult than in Canada. I've always found buses confining. It was a pleasure to be on the open road again. I got rides with ranchers who offered me coca leaves, farmers offered me melons, and a salesman who bought me dinner. Once we stopped at a steakhouse. A waiter brought forth a long sword skewered with meat. Holding the sword in his left hand, he carved off slices of meat with his right. He continued carving until you told him to stop. The first course was beef, followed by lamb, ham, and pork. Then a waiter brought out a trolley with a dozen different salads and vegetables. Once again he served each dish until he was told to stop. It was almost like a buffet, except they brought the buffet to your table. The total cost of the meal was $5. Hitchhiking in Argentina was just like hitchhiking anywhere else. Sometimes you got one ride after another. Other times you could wait or walk for hours before getting a lift. My second night found me on a deserted rural road. Just before dark I was given a ride in the back of a hay wagon. There was one other passenger, a colored boy in his early 20s. It was a slow, uneventful journey, and I caught a couple of hours of badly needed sleep. I was woken up shortly before midnight. The wagon was turning down a farm lane, and the colored boy and I were deposited in the middle of nowhere. It was a damp, foggy night with a distinct chill in the air. We shared a couple of cigarettes and stamped our feet for an hour, but not a single vehicle went by. It was too cold to sleep on the ground, so we decided to walk to keep warm. At one point we passed a cemetery, the tombstones barely visible through the fog. The echo of our footsteps on the pavement set off a chorus of howling by nearby farm dogs. I admit it was rather spooky, but I was genuinely surprised when my friend turned to me, the whites of his eyes bulging out in terror. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked in a trembling voice. "Of course not," I reassured him. He looked at me dubious, but seemed to relax a little. The dogs howled nearby. It was impossible to tell the distance because the fog distorted the sound. "But I do believe in dogs." His eyes turned white again. Sometime in the middle of the night we came across an army roadblock. The sentry shouted something, and when we emerged from the fog, we were covered by a machine gun. We were escorted into a small, brightly lit office in order to produce our papers. The colored boy was checked briefly and told to be on his way. I wasn't so lucky. The soldier seemed to be illiterate and had no real interest in my passport. He was more interested in my knapsack and told me to empty the contents on a table. Just then a car shone its headlights on the roadblock. The two soldiers went out, checked identity papers, and opened the trunk for inspection. Apparently satisfied, they lifted the roadblock and the car sped off. One of them stayed in the sentry hut, the other came back inside. The first thing that caught his attention was the transistor radio. He confirmed that I had brought it with me in Argentina, and then informed me I was under arrest for smuggling contraband goods. I was hungry, tired, and out of patience. I told him to go to hell. The radio was my only friend I had that spoke English. He only spoke Spanish, but he caught the drift of my meaning, and forgetting about the radio, he looked for other booty. Then he came across a pair of cheap earrings that I had bought for a seagull in La Paz. They were brass with ruby-colored glass. They were so cheap that when I eventually returned to Canada and gave them to her, she refused to wear them. But the soldier's eyes lit up. He claimed they were gold, and this time I was under arrest for smuggling gold. He didn't say so, but it was mutually understood that he was willing to confiscate the earrings and drop the charges. "No way," I protested. "They're for my girlfriend. Not your girlfriend, my girlfriend." The soldier shrugged his shoulders and kept looking through the contents of the knapsack. Finally he came across a rather impressive nail clipper I had bought in La Paz for less than $1. "Okay," I laughed, "you got yourself a deal." He got the nail clippers, and I picked up my knapsack and walked on down the road. This was in the Salta district, very close to the Chaco, that region of Argentina known for its isolation, large ranches, gauchos of cowboys, and beef cattle. In the morning I got a ride into Salta, a medium-sized town. I ate breakfast and hit the road again, well aware that Buenos Aires was over 1,000 miles from the Bolivian border. Tucumán was halfway to the capital, and the first large-scale town I had seen since Santa Cruz. I was impressed by the crowded streets, the automobile traffic, and most of all the bars, especially the bars. By chance I stumbled into a tavern that seemed to double as a chess club. There were at least a dozen people playing, mostly with clocks. It was an unexpected bonus. I drank a couple of quarts of beer to quench my thirst and played a few games to refresh my mind. They were good players. I won one game and lost two. I was consoling myself for my most recent loss with another quart of beer when a stranger approached me and sat down at my table. After going through the usual introductory conversation, he mentioned he worked for a pensioner rooming house in town. He said his mistress was fond of fair-haired Aryan boys and suggested I accompany him back to the pension. He said I was welcome to share their evening meal, drink beer all night, and probably share his mistress's bed that night. It was a most interesting proposition. Either he was queer, in which case he would wind up with a bloody nose, or he was pimping for his female boss. I had a funny feeling that I should forget the whole thing, but on the other hand I had nothing else to do and nowhere else to go. Why not? I thought, and picking up my knapsack I followed him through the streets and took him on. The pension or hotel was quite an elaborate affair. High stone walls faced the street. Inside was a courtyard and newer garden. The main building was 2 stories high with a large dining room on the ground floor. Actually, it was more of a house than a hotel, with only 3 or 4 boarding guests. The mistress of the house was a bit of a disappointment. She was an incredibly fat German lady in her late 40s. The real surprise was a large swastika flag and a portrait of Adolf Hitler, which dominated one wall. I had heard that there is a large German community in Argentina, but never expected to see anything like this. After introductions were made and beer was served, the lady of the house showed me the family photographs which hung on the walls. There was a picture of her grandfather taken during the First World War. He was a handsome man, standing tall and direct, his chest covered with medals. There was a photograph of her father in the uniform of the Third Reich, also covered with medals, and a group photograph in which she pointed out her fiancé who had been killed in action. There was something nostalgic and tragic about the whole situation. I too had relatives who had fought in 2 world wars, and except for an accident of fate, it could have been their photographs which hung on the wall. I experienced an overwhelming sense of futility of war. The lady explained to me that she and her brother had immigrated to Argentina in 1945, which by coincidence was the year I was born. I complimented her on the photograph of her grandfather and pointed to the medals on his chest. He was obviously a brave man. She beamed with pride and pointed to her brother and fiancé. They too were brave men, I assured her. It was when she pointed to our Fuhrer that something snapped inside of me. Hitler was an asshole, I blurted out with an anger that surprised even myself. You could have heard a pin drop. I attempted to mollify her again by praising the bravery of her relatives. It worked. The subject was dropped and we sat down to a luxurious roast beef dinner. The servant cleared away the dishes, the beer started flowing. When the conversation turned into domestic politics, I did more listening than talking. The major problem, according to the lady of the house and her 2 friends who joined us, was economic. Inflation was running at 1,000% per year. Bombings and bank robberies by left-wing guerrilla groups were still daily occurrences, but the government had imposed a military curfew, and anyone on the streets between dusk and dawn was asking to be arrested or shot. The police and military, she assured me, were good friends of hers and had the situation well in control. The mention of a curfew made me uneasy, but she assured me I was a guest for the night. After that I relaxed and gave up any attempt at sobriety. In fact, if I was going to do what I felt I was expected to do, I'd have to be as drunk as possible. At first everything went okay as the beer mellowed us and relaxed our inhibitions. It was towards midnight things turned sour. The servant brought us another round of beer and the lady of house raised her glass in a salute. Heil Hitler! I was thirsty, but there was no way I was going to drink a toast like that, so I made one of my own. Hitler scheiss essen, a literal translation of which is Hitler eats shit. It was what novelists refer to as a pregnant pause. I gripped the neck of the beer bottle, tensing myself for any eventuality. Nothing happened. We finished the beer and the whole process repeated itself. Chapter 5. Brazil. Walking off the pier at Montevideo was like Eventually, the other man drifted upstairs and we were left alone. Suddenly, she hiked her skirt up over her thighs. She wasn't wearing any panties. You like? Eat. I got up in disgust and crossed over to the other side of the room. I'll sleep here, I said, indicated the floor. I'll leave as soon as curfew is ended. Rafael, she shouted. Two men came downstairs. Angrily, she ordered me to leave. After the curfew, I protested. The men hesitated. Call the police, she ordered. I wasn't that drunk. Fucking Nazi, I growled. I grabbed my knapsack and headed out the door. The courtyard was in darkness. One of the men came out and unlocked the garden gate. I slipped out into the deserted shadow. There was nothing, deserted street. There was nothing in sight. Sticking to the shadows, I made my way to a park several blocks away and crawled into the bushes. The sound of traffic woke me up. I was still groggy and slightly drunk from the night before. The memories of the previous evening left me humiliated and shamed. The one thing I was thankful for was not being caught after curfew. No thanks to the Nazi mistress. I brushed the grass out of my hair and drank several cups of coffee before hitting the road again. It took me 2 days to hitch the 500 or so miles to Buenos Aires. My last ride was with a salesman. When we got around to discussing local politics, he mentioned he was a fascist. Statements like this still threw me for a loop. My surprise must have shown on my face, for he explained that he didn't consider himself a Nazi at all. Politics in Argentina was different. Left-wing parties were involved in a guerrilla war. Supporters of the military junta were at war with the people. Democracy simply didn't work and was incapable of stopping the bloodshed. When he said he was a fascist, he meant he was a Peronist. Like most members of the middle class, he valued stability above everything else, and the benign dictatorship of Juan Perón was the last regime to provide military and economic stability. We were entering the heavy populated province of Buenos Aires, and towns became more frequent. The large ranches of the Chaco region were replaced by smaller dairy and vegetable farms. Traffic was heavier, and factories belched smoke over new housing developments. The tropical vegetation had long since disappeared. In fact, the countryside seemed quite similar to Ontario. The biggest surprise, seeing as it was late spring, was watching the maple trees turn color. At 35 degrees latitude, Buenos Aires was as far south of the equator as Tennessee was north. Because it was in the southern hemisphere, the seasons were reversed. Climatically, it was fall, and there was a distinct chill in the night air. As we approached the capital, the paved highway turned into 3-lane expressways, complete with the first cloverleaf on and off ramps I had seen since leaving North America. Toronto and Montreal, the largest cities in Canada, have about 2 million people each. With a population of 13 million, Buenos Aires was about 6 times their size and at least twice the size of New York. All the roads lead to the capital, and in Argentina you either come from Buenos Aires or from the countryside. It was exciting to be back in the big city. The noise, crowds, lights, and confusion were a pleasant change from the loneliness of the open road. I went from bar to bar, sightseeing like a tourist. Nobody paid any attention to a stranger with a knapsack on his back. Well, almost nobody. At one intersection, an unmarked car swerved to a stop, and 2 policemen jumped out. One of them fingered a submachine gun while the other checked my identity papers. It was an unpleasant reminder that this was a city at war. The next morning I went to the Canadian Embassy. I had less than $100 left in cash. I had a choice of either being repatriated or sending for money from home. I had already traveled about 6,000 miles since sending Seagull back to Canada. I had gone as far north as I could with the funds at my disposal. I wired my parents to send me $500 of the 1,000 I had left with them for emergencies. That would have to see me to Rio, where hopefully there would be a letter waiting from Seagull. Please God, I thought, let her answer me yes. Every night I thought of her and I missed her horribly. I regretted the argument we had in Columbia. Would I have done things differently if I had another chance? Perhaps so. In the meantime, I rented a room in a quiet residential area of old stone houses and wrought iron balconies. The Spanish architecture brought back memories of Barcelona. The antiquated plumbing reminded me of Rome. At $7 per night, it was the cheapest accommodation I could find, but I wondered about the plight of the unemployed. Later that night, I discussed the problem with a friend I had made in a tavern. Inflation and economic uncertainty meant a high rate of unemployment. The working class areas of Buenos Aires were overcrowded and desperate. Anyone who was lucky enough to find a job supported his family and relatives. Those who couldn't pay the rent were evicted and sought temporary shelter in derelict buildings. In some areas, there were whole blocks of squatters. They lived in overcrowded slums without water or electricity, and eked out a bare existence under the watchful eyes of the secret police. There were too many unemployed to arrest them all. Instead, the police concentrated on any signs of social or political organization. My friend mentioned a doctor he had gone to school with. The doctor was apolitical and had a fairly well-to-do practice, but 2 days a week he treated squatters in a street clinic for free. This was enough to condemn him as a revolutionary in the eyes of the military junta. One night he disappeared and was never seen again. With an inflation rate of 1,000% per year, it was virtually impossible to keep track of what anything cost. Restaurants were required by law to post their menus and prices in their front window. Even then, the bill could be considerably higher than the menu indicated. There seemed to be little rhyme or reason to prices. A meal of steak, peas, and potatoes could cost $3. That was $1 for the steak, $1 for the peas, and $1 for the potatoes. Compared to Canada, meat was cheap and vegetables were expensive. Coffee cost 75 cents a cup, approximately twice what it cost in Canada, even though it was imported from Brazil right next door. Beer, however, was only 50 cents a quart. Later I would joke with friends that I was so broke in Argentina that I was forced to live on steak and beer. It sounds strange, but it was the truth. It took 2 weeks for the $500 to be wired from Hamilton, Ontario to Buenos Aires. The embassy gave me an advance. I spent a lot of time on the Avenue, Florida, in movie theaters and bars. One friend took me to a soccer match. When he warned me to follow his lead and stay clear of the mounted police, I thought he was joking. Sure enough, there were clusters of mounted police around each entrance to the stadium. There are also a score of riot police trucks. Soccer matches in Europe and South America sometimes erupted in bloody riots. The paranoid military dictatorship was taking no chances. They were there in full force. Each team has its own end of the stadium. It also had its own fans, and it was a clearly defined line. Feelings ran pretty high at these games, and to be isolated in a hostile crowd wasn't wise. The size of the stadium was awesome, and it was filled with people. I've traveled extensively in both Europe and Asia. I've never seen so many people in one place in my entire life. The individual feels almost insignificant in such a situation, and the crowd takes on a life of its own. It was only a domestic match, but soccer, also called football, was the national sport of Argentina and most of South America, and the players were professionals. Every village, no matter how poor or small, had at least one communal soccer ground, and it was every boy's dream to be a star player on one of the national teams. It was a fast and aggressive game, and fans on both sides whipped themselves into a frenzy. It was infectious. I got a little excited myself, especially when the opposing team came close to our goalpost. Naturally, I stood up to get a better view. My friend tugged my sleeve and pulled me down again. However, the next time the opposing team came close to scoring a goal, I forgot myself again and stood to my feet to get a better view. Once again, my friend insisted I sit back down. Then he explained to me, in Argentine soccer, to stand to one's feet is a sign of approval, and I shouldn't be cheering the other team. Most of the time I would walk through the city for a couple of hours, then rest in a tavern for a few beers, then walk the city for a couple of hours more. One day I was exploring the waterfront and the docks, which covered a considerable area. Around supper time I stopped in a local tavern. It was a working-class bar, mostly stevedores, no sailors. As soon as I walked in, the atmosphere changed. It was unmistakably hostile and suspicious. It wasn't the usual anti-gringo resentment either. It rang deeper than that. It was the kind of resentment police reserve for suspected undercover agents or police spies. I ordered a quart of beer and started drinking. Maybe my paranoia eased after the third quart, or maybe the people around me realized that no police spy would be so foolish to get drunk in a situation like that. Gradually we drifted into conversation, but we mostly stayed clear of politics. I had gotten the feeling in Argentina that it was impolite and perhaps unwise to question a person's politics too closely. There was hardly any need to. As dock workers, they would have left-wing sympathies. As union members, they would be politically organized. I presume they weren't too fond of the military junta and their secret police and terror squads. I shared their revulsion. I wasn't too fond of the secret police in my own country either. When my money arrived, I paid off a $200 advance from the embassy, stuck the other $300 in my pocket, and bought a ticket on the ferry to Montevideo. The ferry left in the evening, crossed the Rio de Plata during the night, and arrived at Uruguay around 6 in the morning. Chapter 5, Brazil. Walking off the pier at Montevideo was like walking onto the set of a 1940s movie. The first thing that struck me was the age of the cars. In Colombia, for example, there are a lot of 20-year-old cars. In North America, they were junked, but in South America, they were recycled. Montevideo is something else. The cars were 40 years old, but kept in almost immaculate condition. The waterfront area was still deserted. It was early in the morning and the newspaper vendors and coffee shops were just beginning to open. There were a number of Negroes on the street. Not that there were that many, but all of a sudden I realized that they had been conspicuously absent throughout most of Argentina, Bolivia, and Peru. There was an enormous gulf between the Caribbean and Inca cultures. The dividing line was the edge of the Amazon jungle where the steep ascent of the Andes produced a dramatic change in climate. I found a reasonable pension in a side street and paid for a couple of days in advance. Shortly before noon I went into a tavern for my first beer. In North America the most popular bottle was the pint. In most of South America they served quart bottles. In Uruguay they served gallon jugs of beer. Throughout most of South America the German expertise in brewing produced a superior beer. In Uruguay it was second to none. Each succeeding glass lifted a burden from my shoulders. I drank alone with the ghosts of my memories. Memories that would never be still, but whose voices became softer and more mellow with intoxication. I managed to finish the gallon, but I was in no shape to explore the city. I barely tottered back to my room before sinking into oblivion. The second day I spent sightseeing. On the third day I was back on the road. There were 4 or 5 short lifts in the morning. In the afternoon I got a ride with 3 girls. They were university students in Montevideo. They were young, healthy, and exuded sex. They were also bright, intelligent, and the future leaders of their country. Like Argentina, Uruguay lived under a military dictatorship. The most vocal opposition came from the Tupamaro guerrillas, who robbed banks and butcher shops and distributed the money and food in the slums. The Tupamaros were especially daring. They once returned to a bank they had robbed a year earlier under the pretext of making a movie. Having secured the cooperation of the management, guards, tellers, and police, they proceeded to rob it again. Taken as a whole, urban terrorism seemed to do little to improve the living conditions in Uruguay. I suppose that with all the peaceful avenues of dissent closed, there's little choice. In general, I feel that political terrorism simply excuses greater military repression. If you get shot for being out after curfew, it makes little difference whether the soldier is paid by a left-wing government or a right-wing government. The result is the same. The university girls made it clear that they had their share of friends who had simply disappeared. As usual, it was the cream, the student union leaders, the journalists, the political scientists, the poets who rallied against the system who were marked for removal. Girls asked me about Canada and what the young people were doing there. It was hard to answer. The hippie movement was more culturally oriented than politically. Instead of becoming political terrorists, my friends became dealers. It was a different kind of war. Guns weren't as important, but the organization was just as secretive and the danger from informants just as real. The sentences were almost as long, 7 years to life for importing drugs. The psychedelic revolution actually succeeded in the sense that drug use, far from being eliminated, became an integral part of North American culture. However, somewhere along the way, the message seemed to be waylaid. Today's dope smoker is more likely to be concerned with a new stereo than his spiritual enlightenment. The dealers had a tendency to be corrupted by money in the same way political revolutionaries became corrupted by power. The girls drove me to a small resort town on the coast, not far from the Brazilian border. They were on vacation for the weekend and invited me to stay over with them. I admit I was tempted. In retrospect, I wish I did, but at the time I was seriously concerned about my money. I had to reach Rio as quickly as possible. I still miss Seacall in the worst possible way. My next ride was in the back of a camper. We crossed the frontier at dusk, and I stretched out to make myself comfortable. My lift was going to Porto Alegre, almost 300 miles distance. The truck was a 4-cylinder Japanese import. The road was narrow but paved, and we made good time traveling. I watched the cars out the window. The constellations were unfamiliar as we were still far south of the equator. It was also almost midnight when we reached Porto Alegre. The town, at least the section I was in, was surprisingly modern and clean. Southern Brazil has a cool, temperate climate. It resembled Europe more than South America. The bar I wandered into had mostly European patrons. They were white, clean, and well-dressed. There was even a color TV. It could have been back in Canada, except the announcer spoke in Portuguese. I ordered a quart bottle of beer called Brahmin Special. It was excellent beer, but I couldn't help thinking that whoever named it had a sense of humor. Brahmins are the upper caste Hindus in India, and their religion forbids the consumption of alcohol. I spent the night curled up in my sleeping bag in the park. By dawn, I was on the road again. There seemed to be more cars than in Argentina. The most common by far was the Volkswagen Beetle. They were manufactured in Brazil and ran on alcohol instead of gasoline. The farms in the countryside were large and plowed by tractors. Everywhere there are signs of prosperity not found anywhere else in South America, with the possible exception of Santa Cruz. One of my rides was with a Japanese engineer. He had been in Brazil for 10 years and was going to stay for 5 more before going home. According to him, the Japanese had played a large role in both capital and expertise in the modernization of Brazil. Imports were highly taxed to encourage local manufacturing. Wherever possible, substitutions for imports were encouraged, such as alcohol for gasoline. On the border with Paraguay, they harnessed the highest waterfall in the world to provide hydroelectric power. Such huge projects required enormous amounts of capital, and strict currency controls were required to pay Brazil's foreign debts. For example, Brazilian citizens were limited as to the amount of money they could take on a vacation outside the country, and had to post a $2,000 bond with the government to ensure their return if they traveled outside of South America. The forced pace of industrialization demanded a controlled economy, and technically Brazil was a military dictatorship under President Grieveson. Despite this, there was a large degree of artistic and personal freedom, and the military and the police were inconspicuous. Sao Paulo was the industrial heartland of the nation. Its population was over 9 million. It reminded me of Mexico City. It was an uncontrolled jungle of growth covered by red industrial smog. Traffic was continuous and the noise deafening. I booked a room for the night and spent the afternoon and evening wandering the streets. Afterwards I took a bath and slept in my first bed since I had left Buenos Aires a week previously. There is a peculiar loneliness in being a stranger in a large city. Drinking didn't help. When I looked around at the chaotic confusion, I was left wondering what it was all about. I looked at my reflection in a mirror. My boots were worn, my clothes dusty, and my hair unkempt and tousled. I looked like a tramp, which I suppose in reality was exactly what I was. On impulse, I decided to go into a barber shop. My Portuguese was practically non-existent, so I indicated with my fingers that I wanted it kept fairly long. He used the electric shaver, and my hair started disappearing at an alarming rate. Searching my limited vocabulary, I said mas. He immediately took another swipe and then rounded it off with the scissors. Once again I said mas, and he took off another inch. Mas, I shouted in alarm, and he took another swipe. In a panic, I gestured with my hands for him to stop. The poor barber was quite excited himself by now. It wasn't until later that evening, as I gazed ruefully at my reflection in a bar mirror, that I realized what had happened. It was my fault. I had confused the word mas, which means more in Portuguese, with the word boss, which means enough in Urdu. When I thought I was shouting stop, I was really shouting more. 2 days later, I was in Rio de Janeiro. My ride dropped me off in the middle of the city. It was almost dusk, so I walked for a little, looking for a cheap hotel. Rio had almost 6 million people. It was only 700 miles north of Sao Paulo, but there was a world of difference in atmosphere. The smog and industrial clamor was missing. The people here were more relaxed and easygoing. Sao Paulo was on a plateau. Rio was on the ocean. The climate was much hotter, and the average person darker skinned. I sat down on the edge of a stone fountain to rest. Suddenly there was something crawling over my boot. I hastily shook it off and stooped down to examine it. My God, it was a cockroach, but what a size! It was at least 3 inches long and about 10 times the size of anything I'd seen in North America. Suddenly the ground around the fountain was covered with them. I hurried off in search of a room and a cold beer. It was difficult to sleep that night, knowing my future lay in an envelope in the American Express office. Would her answer be yes or no? I loved her as much as life myself. If I returned to Canada and continued leading the kind of life that I had been, it could only be a matter of time before the odds ran against me. Was it worth going back, or should I start life over here in Brazil? Yes, it was worth going back because I loved her. If life meant anything, if the pain of loving had any meaning, then it was Seagull and the child that she would one day bear me. I was nervous when I went into the American Express office. I was devastated when I came out. There was no reply, none at all. It was impossible. It was at least a month and a half since I'd written her, more than enough time for her to reply. I found a tavern and ordered a beer. Once the shock wore off, I found myself smiling. What I had asked her to do was make a decision. No answer meant no decision. What she'd done was to neatly throw the ball right back in my court. I caught a city bus to the beach. Copacabana had the same. It was a weekday. The beach was covered with people. They had the consistent tan of people who live close to nakedness. Never have I seen more beautiful women in one place. The sand was glistening white, the ocean turquoise blue. Sugarloaf Mountain shimmered in the heat, rising softly above the city. For years I wanted to see Rio de Janeiro. Always it had been a dream, just beyond reach. Now the dream had become a reality. What comes next? I picked up a short stick and absently etched Seagull into the sand. I had $500 back in Canada and about $100 with me in Brazil. If I returned to Canada, I needed that $500 to reestablish myself with an apartment. I still had a car parked in the garage. That meant being repatriated by the Canadian government, sort of an interest-free travel loan. There is a Canadian embassy in Brasilia, the futuristic capital carved out of the Amazon forest. That was the last embassy until Caracas, Venezuela. There were British consuls in Belém at the mouth of the Amazon River and in Georgetown, Guyana. They functioned as substitutes where there was no Canadian diplomatic presence. This was probably the only time I'd be in South America in my life. I wanted to see as much as possible. The problem was that the roads ended at Belém. It was only a few hundred miles to Georgetown as the crow flies, but the land in between was impenetrable jungle. So far the people I had talked to said there was no alternative to taking a plane. But I was sure I'd be able to find a boat going up the coast or a riverboat going up the Amazon to Buenos. From there it might be possible to take jungle paths to Letzia and cross into Colombia. I was poorly equipped for jungle treks. My sleeping bag had served me well through the Andes and most of South America, but in the jungle they used hammocks. A sleeping bag was worse than useless. Not only was it too hot, but it was an open invitation to being bitten by snakes, spiders, or poisonous insects. One of my rides had told me about the chichi bug. It resembled an ordinary insect bite, but it injected a poisonous substance into the blood. Strangely enough, it took 10 years for the symptoms to appear, but by that time it was fatal. Then there were swarms of killer bees, which had originated in Africa and were brought to Southern America, not to mention malaria-carrying mosquitoes. I decided to visit the General Hospital in Rio and have a medical checkup while getting some quinine tablets. It was hot in the sun, so I stripped down to my shorts and plunged into the surf of the ocean. The water was warm and salty. Strangely enough, although the beach was crowded, very few people were in the water. For 10 minutes I swam out about 50 yards and then body surfed the waves back to the beach. Once I came up a few feet from another swimmer. He asked me if I was a good swimmer. "Not really," I replied modestly. Then he pointed to a sign in Portuguese saying there was a dangerous undertow at this time of year. Suddenly that explained why there are so many people on the beach and so few in the water. I quickly got out and dried myself in the sun. The doctor who examined me that afternoon said I was in perfect health. When I complained about a heaviness I had experienced recently, he asked me how much I had been drinking. I suppose the answer was obvious. When I asked about quinine tablets, he claimed that malaria had been virtually eliminated in Brazil. I had heard much to the contrary, but I presumed that he knew his business. At least I hoped he did. It had been almost a month since I gotten high, an unusual abstinence in a 20-year habit. It had been virtually unobtainable in Bolivia and Argentina, and definitely too dangerous to ask. Brazil was a different matter. Supposedly they grew some dynamite grass, and it shouldn't have been too hard to find in a Caribbean culture. That evening I asked around in a few bars, but with discouraging results. Either the penalties for trafficking were very severe, or they thought I was an undercover policeman, or both. The solution came as a pleasant surprise. Prostitution was virtually legal in Brazil. As long as they had regular medical checkups for venereal diseases and didn't rob their customers, they were ignored by the police. I picked up a girl in a bar, and after buying her a few drinks, she readily agreed to turn a trick for $10. There's a catch, though. I told her I couldn't get in the mood for sex unless I smoked grass first. She was a sweet young thing and asked around the bar for me, but nobody seemed to be holding. Finally, she told me she could get some in the Felva near where she lived. The Felva were the slums, which were on the hills overlooking the city. The inhabitants of the Felva were squatters and outcasts. They paid no taxes, but there were no roads, no water, and no electricity. There was also no employment, and they eked out a living any way they could. We took a taxi to a square at the foot of the hill. From there we climbed a long series of stone steps to a level area which overlooked the city. It was already dark, and the lights twinkled softly in the tropical evening. I had to pause to catch my breath. We'd been climbing steeply for the past 10 minutes. From there we followed a footpath for another 10 minutes. The footpath broadened into a narrow laneway. It was only about 6 feet wide. On either side there were huts with corrugated iron roofs. There were no street lamps, but a kerosene lamp flickered in every fourth or fifth window. Gutters were dug along the walls, and presumably the next rain would wash away the garbage that was thrown there. It was hot, and the stench assaulted the nostrils. We stopped before one shack, and she asked me to wait outside. Reluctantly, I gave her $10 to score and wondered if I'd ever see her again. I need to have worried. She returned a few minutes later with an ounce of grass. We went back the way we had come. It was easier going down than climbing up, but when we reached the top of the stone steps, I stopped to rest and smoke a joint. It was a magical evening, and the moon was rising. At my urging, she took a few puffs. A couple of youths passed by and stopped to talk with her. She translated for me, and I rolled another joint and passed it around. Soon there were about half a dozen of us. Everything was going fine until a couple of men in their late 20s joined us. Quickly the mood began to sour. They wanted me to buy some cocaine, and they had a lean, hungry look. The vibe suddenly turned bad, and I realized how vulnerable I was if they decided to jump me. I looked at the girl I had picked up. She was becoming agitated and motioned for me to leave. I left them the joint and rapidly started down the steps. I could hear her arguing with her friends. I'm not sure whether it was coincidence or not, but when I reached the plaza and started looking for a taxi, I was stopped by an unmarked police car, and they asked for identity papers. I showed them my passport. They asked me what I had been doing in the Felva, but I feigned ignorance of their meaning, only too conscious of the ounce of pot in my boot. Finally, they released me, and I took a taxi back to the bar I had come from. I didn't get laid, but I had succeeded in my original intention of finding some smoke. Brasilia was an urban planner's dream. The concept was to build a modern capital from scratch, and in doing so to open up the interior of the Amazon. There was no transportation system, no indigenous labor force, and no industrial base. On paper, it seemed a good idea. Brazil was to be a shining example of third world industrialization. The economic problems inherent in outside capitalization had not yet surfaced. There were the inevitable cost overruns and time delays. Industry showed a remarkable reluctance to conform to idealistic planning. The workers who constructed the concrete fantasy didn't move away afterwards, as was expected, and the contrast between the empty modern architecture and the crowded shanty towns on its outskirts became embarrassing. As the capital, it was naturally expected that the foreign embassies would move there, but there is a reluctance on the part of the foreign diplomatic corps. They enjoyed the night air and the climate and the ocean in Rio de Janeiro. No one wanted to be posted to the hot, steamy, and boring interior. The road to Belém was paved but narrow. The countryside was flat with dense vegetation and little inhabitation. Traffic was almost non-existent except for occasional truck carrying lumber or agricultural crops. The people, however, were friendly and rarely passed me by. The buildings were built of concrete blocks and corrugated iron sheet roofs, materials impervious to moisture and jungle decay. It rained almost every day, the heavy torrential thunderstorms common to tropical climates. Belém was the port at the mouth of the Amazon River. The only road which connected it to the outside world was the one I had taken from Brasilia. The real road was the Amazon River itself, which snaked inland for thousands of miles to the Andes watershed. There were a few towns in the interior. Manaus was the most important, followed by Iniquitos and Lazia. In most respects, Belém was the proverbial end of the earth. The architecture was colonial Portuguese. I found a room in a pension in a quiet and well-kept residential district. There was a profusion of colorful tropical flowers. That afternoon I spent wandering through the small and naturally quiet town. There was an office district which housed the government offices of various banks, merchant shipping offices, insurance firms, and diplomatic buildings, including the British consul. There is a commercial district of small shops and stores, a warehouse, a docking area along the bank of the river, and the inevitable street of waterfront bars catering to visiting seamen and local hustlers. Most of my time was spent in the bars. Belém was practically on the equator. If it wasn't raining, then it was too hot to walk around comfortably. By contrast, the bars were kept cool by shuttered windows and high revolving ceiling fans. It had been a long and arduous journey from Buenos Aires, and I had been traveling almost continuously. Now, at the end of the earth, it was time to relax, and one quart of beer followed another. Days began to blur together. To be quite truthful, I don't remember much of this period. Alcohol provided a common bond, even if our languages differed. Several times I remember drinking steadily, usually with a bar girl for company, until I blacked out. In the morning I would wake up back at my pension with no idea how I had gotten there or how the previous evening had ended. $100 dwindled to 10 and finally disappeared altogether. Out of necessity, I began panhandling in the streets. There is always the odd tourist or sailors on shore leave who were generous enough to give me a few cruzeros, enough for a sandwich or a bottle of beer, but it wasn't enough. When my money ran out, so did the beer and the marijuana. That was when the nightmares began. Once I had woken up screaming. All I could remember of the dream was a hideous creature that was half fox and half rabbit. There is no way to explain the pure terror I felt. It was as if I had seen the devil himself. Only years later, when studying medieval European paintings, did I realize that unnatural creatures, combining half one species and half another, were a common symbol of the devil and hell. Obviously, I was having the DTs from alcohol withdrawal. In another vivid dream, I was walking with my father. He was drunk and unwashed. His tattered clothes stank of shit. He had shit his pants and asked me to help him find a washroom. Leaning on my arm for support, we went from bar to bar asking to use their facilities. None of them would let us use the washroom. The last one, the manager screamed at me to get him off the premises. Tears filled my eyes. Couldn't they see he was a human being? Didn't being human count for anything? My frustration exploded. I grabbed the neck of a whiskey bottle and smashed it over the table. Suddenly I woke up, drenched with sweat, sweating uncontrollably. It was all a nightmare. I realized what had happened. In reality, my father was a paragon of middle-class virtue. He was prim and proper and hardly ever took a drink. What I had done was unconsciously exchange my father's role for myself. If I had felt ashamed of him in my dream, how would he feel about me in reality? I was at the end of my rope and too sick to go any further. As the last straw, my landlady was screaming for last week's back rent that I owed her. I no longer had a choice. It was time to go to the British consul and ask to be repatriated back home. The consul was a distinguished gray-haired man in his 50s. His office had rosewood paneling with the obligatory oil portraits of the royal family. Repatriation was a fairly rare part of his duties, and almost always concerned British sailors who had jumped ship or had passed out on shore leave and been left behind. He had never ran across this exact situation before, at least not with a Canadian. He did agree to contact the Canadian Embassy in Rio, who in turn would have to contact the Foreign Affairs Office in Ottawa. The wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly, and he warned me that it could take several weeks. In the meantime, I would be given an allowance of $20 a day. In return, I had to surrender my passport and was given a yellow sheet of paper indicating I was under the protection of the British consul. I suppose $20 a day was regarded as the absolute minimum necessary for a white man to survive in this country. To me, however, $20 was considerably more than I had been used to. It was time to celebrate. I immediately ate a large meal of meat and potatoes and returned to my favorite waterfront bar. By nightfall, I had restored my mental equilibrium and was feeling fairly jovial about the situation. In fact, I decided to share my good fortune with a girl. She was a pretty young thing, barely 16, and had a bit more class than the usual bar girls who frequented the tavern. She agreed to turn a trick with me for $10, but I used my usual ploy that I couldn't get it on unless I smoked some grass first. We took a taxi to a slum area off the waterfront. Her connection lived in a colony of huts that were built out in a swamp. To get there, we had to traverse a series of rickety wooden causeways. It was pitch dark and I couldn't see a thing. She took my hand and warned me to follow her carefully. Eventually we stopped and I gave her $5 to go ahead to a hut to complete the transaction. The tropical moon was hidden behind the clouds. I waited in the warm darkness, listening to frogs with just a tinge of anticipation. Soon the wooden causeway creaked and I was aware that someone was coming. I couldn't see her but smelled her perfume. I insisted on taking the grass and shoving it inside my boots. She took my hand and led me back to the safety of the illuminated streets. She was eager to go to a hotel, but I convinced her to stop along the way for a couple of beers at a nearby tavern. We had just ordered a couple of drinks and were flirting with each other when the door opened and two uniformed police came in. They walked directly to our table and demanded my passport. I handed them the yellow sheet of paper the British consul had given me that morning, but they merely laughed and said, "Come with us." She jumped to my defense and said that they had no business taking me away. They laughed again, and the other cop took her arm. They escorted us both out the door and put us in the back of a yellow Volkswagen that was a standard police cruiser in Brazil. She started to cry, and I tried to console her. "Not a problema, not a problema," I bravely bluffed. "Oh, mucho problema," she insisted. Apparently the maximum penalty for possession of narcotics was also 15 years in Brazil. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach that extended right down to my boots where I had hidden the ounce of pot. She started speaking to the police officer in rapid Portuguese. Then she whispered to me, "If we give them $10, they will let us go." I hesitated, but not for long. I gave her the last $10 I had, and the police cruiser pulled over the curb. The driver got out and went for a walk. She gave the other police officer $10, and he got out and opened the door for us. I could hardly believe our good fortune. We quickly walked 5 or 6 blocks to where she claimed she lived. It was a modest 3-room bungalow. Her mother was home. They talked excitedly for several minutes. Meanwhile, I lit a joint. After an experience like this, I needed one. "We can't sleep here," she said disappointedly. "Mother won't let us." "My darling," I said sadly, "that was my last $10. I can't pay you now." "I know," she said, clenching her fists. "Those bloody pigs. Never mind. I want to love you. You have any money left?" "A few dollars," I admitted. "Let's take a taxi," she suggested. "I know a place." It was a short cab ride. It only cost $1. It was back to the slums. After a 5-minute walk, we came to a small one-room hut. The occupants were already asleep and grumbled at being awakened. She negotiated with them, and they let us in. There were 4 cots in the hut, all of them occupied, 2 women and 2 children. At her request, I gave them my last $1, and the 2 women doubled up, leaving us a cot to ourselves. Momentarily, I was embarrassed. To my WASP mentality, sex should be a private, secret thing. Still, when 6 people inhabiting one room, they must be used to anything by now. The woman had turned out the kerosene lantern, but the moonlight still filtered through the shuttered window. I could barely see her, but I could feel and smell her. Her lithe, youthful body responded eagerly to mine, and we made passionate love again and again until we drifted into oblivion, entwined in each other's arms. When I woke in the late morning, the first thing I did was reach for my glasses, but they weren't there. The hut was deserted. I dressed clumsily and searched all around the room, but I couldn't find them. She stirred lazily and reached for me. I was too upset to be romantic. "My glasses," I said in panic. "They're gone." She got up and helped me look. "They're not here," she said, stating the obvious. I was angry, damned angry. I had no intention of leaving without them. "Maybe the children took them," she suggested. I was still angry and explained I was practically blind without them. She convinced me not to make a scene. Taking my arm, she walked me back to her mother's place and borrowed a couple of dollars off her mother so I could take a cab back to the pension. For the next few days I wandered in the fog. Every morning I went to the consul, got my daily allowance, and then went back to my favorite waterfront bar. I'd given up hope of ever seeing them again, but 2 nights later I was drinking alone when someone touched my arm. I looked up, and it was her holding out my glasses. "It was the children," she said, smiling. I asked her to stay and have a beer with me, but she shook her head sadly. "I have to work," she said, smiling. She kissed me lightly on the forehead and slipped out the door. The next 2 weeks went all too quickly. The day before I left, I had a report to the Belém police station. They took my fingerprints and a mugshot. Apparently, I was considered undesirable and would have difficulty ever entering Brazil again. The day I left, I didn't get my usual $20 allowance. Instead, a consular employee drove me to the airport where I was given my plane ticket, a Vargas flight to Miami, and another ticket from Miami to Toronto. Both were stamped non-refundable. As a gesture of goodwill, the driver gave me a package of cigarettes. The stewardess told us to buckle up our seat belts. The palm trees glided by, and soon we bounced into the air and took off towards the northern hemisphere. It was shortly after noon. The stewardess served lunch and came back taking orders for drinks. I watched enviously as people casually placed their orders while I stared morosely out the window. The Caribbean was an aqua green. It was a beautiful day, but I felt lousy. My hands were trembling. I wondered what Seagull was doing and if there was any point in going back to Canada. I nervously smoked one cigarette after another for about 20 minutes and then decided to swallow my pride. I casually caught the attention of the stewardess and explained in a slow, calm voice that I was being repatriated and literally didn't have $1 to my name. On the other hand, I pointed out that I was extremely thirsty and was just dying to have a drink. The stewardess opened her eyes wide in astonishment and said, "Just a minute, sir. I'll have to speak with the captain." A couple of minutes later she returned with 2 large double scotches. "With the captain's compliments," she explained. The end.